Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is a Fang-Tastic adventure. As ever, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share and help build the channel and our community further and help us smash our way through the 30,000 subscriber mark. Big thank you to WolfInSpace, the author of tonight's story. As ever, do take time to check out their link in the description below, and you can find other works by themselves. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's story, entitled The Beast Within. Let's get straight into that. It was the night before graduation in Oxford University. The atmosphere was quiet and birds flew across the sky infrequently. The sun was just beginning to set, illuminating the college skyline. There weren't many people outside, but inside, students were getting ready. Some colleges were holding proms, but most were giving students passes to various restaurants or bars. Graduation is a big thing, and if that means anything, it certainly means partying. Piper Rosenthal was one of the prettiest girls in Lincoln College. She was young and attractive, with long black hair that dropped to her waist and skin paler than satin and softer than snow, with eyes bright violet. She was popular, yet introverted, and fitted into a perfect hourglass shape, and she was eager to get completely shit-faced and went out. It was a boy she liked, and she desperately wanted to take him home. His name was Daniel Adams. He was a sporty type, yet very shy and careful. He looked like an absolute unit. He had short black hair and dark olive skin. He was muscular and heavily built, but at the same time, he was gentle and caring. He loved sport, and he would constantly talk about football and other games. Piper knew where he'd be. He was an avid West Ham fan, and they were playing. So, she went to the nearest sports bar and found him, intently watching the TV with a beer in his hand. Piper went over, sat at his table. He was alone, and there weren't many people there. They were at a larger bar further into town. Daniel looked up. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Piper grinned. "It's the night before graduation, and a lot of the girls in my college are knocking things off their bucket list, and I'm one of them." Daniel shrugged. "And?" he asked. "Danny, I want to sleep with you," Piper said abruptly. "Can it wait? Ham's playing. Till 10. So that's how it went. They got talking about life, work, home. It went until West Ham drew 3-3 with the opposition. "Come on, let's go back to your place," Piper insisted. Danny thought about it for a second. "Sure." Piper grinned and he led her out the bar. She was slightly drunk and Danny remained quiet. They got to his dorm and found a note from his roommate saying he'd gone out. "I've loved you this long." Piper kissed him. Oh, if only she knew. 35 minutes after this, and the two were lying naked next to each other on Danny's bed. Piper leaned over and kissed him, and Danny was still for a moment before breaking into a fit of sobs. "Oh jeez, I've ruined your life." Piper was confused. "What?" I haven't told anyone about this. I'm a werewolf." Piper thought about it for a second. "A werewolf? What kind of next level bullshit is that?" She laughed. Danny didn't do anything. "I'm not lying. Listen to me. If you deny it, then that's it." "Oh, fuck off. Stop joking," Piper angrily replied. She was hit by a violent headache, and she instinctively put her hands to her forehead. "You've got a headache now, haven't you?" Danny stated. Yes," Piper replied quietly. "You're not immune then. The venom has reached your brain. You're fucked." Piper listened intently and reached for the bedsheet. Oh shit! You're a fucking werewolf!" she croaked. "But how?" "I was born it. My mum and dad are too," Danny responded. "But can I only get it if I'm bitten, right?" Piper didn't know why, but she was terrified. "No. Sexual contact, and blood to blood too. Whatever you do, It will not stop. Morning after pills won't kill the poison, Danny croaked. Piper began shaking. Am I going to be in pain when I turn? She croaked. An unbearable amount, so much that you'll want to be dead. Thankfully, a good shot of morphine should do the job. But the transformation will still happen, Danny said, with a noticeable apology in his voice. Will I be alright afterwards, though? After I turn back? Piper wheezed. There are two ways you can go. One, you completely lose it and go insane with the knowledge of being a werewolf. We call these ones the lost. Or two, you stay the same and live with it. They're called the found. First transformations are always rough, and you need someone with you when it happens, Danny explained. Piper exploded into a fit of rage. Why didn't you fucking tell me? I tried to. You didn't listen. Danny recoiled. Piper realised the gravity of the situation. I'm sorry, Danny, Piper gasped. Why? You haven't done anything. Danny tried to pick her up. Piper pulled the covers off her naked body. Where are you going? It's only 11:30. I have to cut this short. She bolted out of bed and towards her clothes. She pulled them on quickly and legged it out of the room and out of the college itself. She didn't look back. She raced back to her dorm. She pulled off her jacket and shoes and leapt into bed, entangling the covers around her, hoping that this was all some bad dream. An agonising sickness overcame, and she woke up at 6 a.m. She was still wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and she was still feeling sick in the stomach. As she sat up, she could definitely tell it wasn't a dream. She whimpered. What was it that Danny had said? Morning after pills won't work. No, that had to be a mistake. Her graduation wasn't until 2 p.m, so she had plenty of time to go to the pharmacy. She went at 10 a.m, after spending the morning throwing up in her room. She barely made it to the pharmacy without throwing up. Before collapsing outside, she heaved herself up and staggered inside. She stumbled through her words and bought the pill. She came home with a box and went through the instructions. She took a double dose, not because she was panicked, but if what Danny had said was true, then she couldn't risk it. Towards lunchtime, she perked up and felt good enough to go to the college garden. She talked to a few of her friends before sitting alone, propped up against a wall. She texted her parents to ask if they were coming. Unfortunately, they weren't, but they said she was more than welcome to stay a few nights. A shadow appeared in front of her, and she looked up, and it was Danny. Go away, she said without hesitation. Danny didn't move. My family has a safe room in our house in London. You could come with me. The next full moon's in 2 days. He sounded hopeful and cheery. Danny, no. If what you're saying is true, then you're the last person I want to talk to. And if it is true, then you have completely ruined my life, Piper retorted. It was worth a shot, Danny added. Piper grimaced and Danny turned away. The full moon's in 2 days. Don't forget, or you could end up killing someone you love. He chuckled and then walked off. After this, Piper was terrified. Danny wasn't lying. Piper wasn't going to believe it though, and she wasn't going to let it get in the way of her reward for her 3 years of hard work. She got her robes on and waited for the ceremony to begin. While she was on the stage, it felt like she could hear everything, from the girls talking at the back of the yard to the discussions of the professors nearby. As well as this, she could not miss the sickly scent of aftershave coming from the boys at the middle of the line. She nearly retched, but took her certificate and left the stage. She had a photo taken, then headed back to her room and packed up. She was due at a train station tomorrow, and after that, she was leaving Oxford. Her parents lived in Cheshire, and she had bought a property in Durham. She was staying there for a few days to recuperate before leaving. It was 6 p.m, and so the bright sunshine was still in the sky. These summer months had been so hot, and Piper was more than happy to be leaving the south. She stripped and had a bath, washing her long black hair, which she hadn't done for a week. She stayed in the hot, soapy water for an hour before getting out and drying herself, and she collapsed onto her bed, exhausted. She fell asleep the moment her head hit the pillow. That night, she had a dream so terrible it shook her to the very core. She remembered the moment before her life, though she didn't want to believe it, was ruined. She imagined her immune system desperately fighting off the venom that was spreading through her body, giving way to hot strands of poison. And then she imagined her ripping her family apart with swift strokes from sharp, inhuman claws and eating what was left. She awoke with a start, and it was 3 a.m. She heard a pounding at her door and could smell Danny. Her roommate answered it. They talked slightly about Piper and a misunderstanding and how Danny just wanted to help her, but to no avail, and he slammed the door and bounded off. Piper's roommate stood at her door for a few moments before disappearing into her own room. Piper curled up into a ball, scared for her own safety, and she was glad to be moving out, back home, somewhere Danny couldn't find her. Piper scrunched her eyes closed and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, she woke up, put on some pants, a bra and a crop top, adding some denim jeans and a leather jacket. She grabbed her trunk and left the dorm. Piper stopped off at the student accommodation office to sign out and hand back her keys before going to the synagogue, as it was a Saturday. It was, at that point, that she realised she couldn't focus, feeling as if it had become so boring. Piper left before the services even ended and ran to the train station. Despite carrying her enormous trunk that weighed in at least 50 kilos, Piper had no problem running so quickly. She ran and ran, reaching the station, taking out her ticket and scanning it through. She boarded the train and laid down her trunk, still with half an hour until the train left. She realised she hadn't eaten, and so went to get something to eat. She walked past a Walk and Go, almost retching at the scent of fresh vegetables. She settled on a Subway and ordered a foot-long Subway melt. She briskly walked back onto the train, still with around 5 minutes before the train left. She picked out the sandwich and held it up to eat, but her body was telling her not to. Her mind was screaming at her to eat the fucking sandwich, but her body remained locked in place. She then laid the baguette down and realised. Piper opened the bread and looked at it. Of course, salad. Why had she ordered salad? She always ordered salad at the end of the day. Did she even have to eat the salad? What the hell is going on with my body? She whimpered under her breath. She brushed off the salad and picked up the meat. It was delicious, as always. But as she held up the sandwich to finish it off, she retched. What a disgusting smell. She threw the bread and the veg in the bin before leaning against the window as the train pulled out of the station. She got back to Cheshire about 4 that afternoon. Her father picked her up from Chester, and they drove the short journey to a small village called Bollington. Piper was happy to be home, but nervous as the full moon was in a day. She didn't even trust everything of what Danny had said, but with everything that was happening, the enhanced hearing, the sense of smell, the aversion to vegetables, it was clear. She was a werewolf. She didn't know what hit her first, the realisation or the knowledge that unless she thought fast, she would go through so much pain, but she didn't care, or the fact that the entire thing could have been avoided if it were not for her stupidity and Danny not pulling out. She broke down in tears. Her father was still driving, but he pulled over and comforted her. Piper didn't know what to do, but she just couldn't think about it. It was probably just that sickness, she hoped. The Rosenthals were a normal Jewish family, to say the least. It consisted of a father, Samuel, who was a rabbi, mother, Catherine, and 3 children, Piper, the oldest, Asia, the middle child and only boy, and Madeline, the youngest, who was 7, 13 years younger than her. Piper was happy to be home in her normal 4-bedroom house on a hill in the middle of Cheshire. That night, the family went over to a friend's house on the other side of town, and before they set off, Piper was getting her shoes on. Asa appeared on the stair. The middle Rosenthal child was skinny, with shoulder-length black hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to pop out of his head. He was quiet and highly similar to Piper. "Why didn't you come and see us last month? It's every 2 weeks, you fucking idiot. And even then, that's pushing it. Does the Sabbath mean anything to you?" He started, angrily. Piper stood for a moment. "Asa," she said politely. "What?" her brother replied. Have you studied at Oxford University for 3 years to get a qualification to give you a job? No. Aza gave Piper a strong gaze, his eyes working to full extent. She glared back. There was a silence for about 10 seconds before they both cracked and burst into laughter. Piper grabbed her brother and hauled him over onto her lap. "Holy shit! When did you go to the gym?" shouted Aza. Piper gasped. "What the fuck?" she whispered under her breath. "Huh? Last time you were here, you couldn't pick me up, but now you can?" replied Aza. "Get off!" Piper commanded. Aza did as he was told. Piper ran into the living room. She looked for something to lift. The sofa. Perfect. No one could lift that on their own. Piper reached out and lifted one half, turning it on its side. She then walked around and picked the entire couch up with her 2 hands. That was enough. "Oh no," Piper whispered and gently dropped it down, finishing getting ready. At the dinner party, Piper went into the garden. There was a large buffet set out, and there was a salad there. Piper knew she would feel sick if she tasted some, let alone swallowed some. She had been brought up to be polite, and so forced down a few mouthfuls. That was a bad idea. She was fine for the first 15 minutes, believing that she was fine to eat as much greenery as possible. She finished a full plate of the stuff, but began to feel rotten. She began to feel dizzy before collapsing on the floor. "Piper!" Aza yelled as he dashed over across the garden to reach his older sister. Piper passed out, unaware of what was going on. She was all right, wasn't she? She sure hoped so. Piper had forgotten what the thing she was worried about was. She woke up in her bed the next morning. She decided to go for a run. That was something she hadn't done for a while. Piper changed into her sports clothing, which still fit her surprisingly. She left her house and went through the hillsides and cliffs, and she ran 15k before breakfast, which was too far. Piper could only run 5k in a single setting, so to run 3 times that was incredible. Piper gorged down her breakfast of a fry-up before the greens from last night came back and she threw up in the toilet. Aza was waiting for her when she came out. "Piper, what is up with you?" he interrogated, his eyes working to full effect. Piper stopped. "I'm fine. It's okay. Don't worry." "No, Piper. What is wrong?" Aza deepened his hypnotic stare, and Piper sighed. "Fine. I had sex with a boy at my college. Ever since then, even after morning after pills, I keep getting sick whenever I eat vegetables and..." "Again? Piper, tell me everything." Aza interrupted her. "He told me he was a werewolf and he told me I was fucked because I wasn't immune and..." "Thank you." Aza finished. He walked forward and gave his sister a hug. "You know I care about you," he whispered. Piper put her arms around him as well, before realizing he was nearly as tall as her. Aza kissed Piper on her forehead and said a prayer in Hebrew over her. "You'll be all right," he said quietly in her ear. Piper's eyes welled up with tears. "I don't want to be a monster," she cried. "Nothing is going to happen, I promise." He clearly made that up. Aza stepped back and strode into the bathroom. "Fucking hell, it stinks in here," he laughed. Piper smiled. She was so lucky to have someone like Aza, so much so she had forgotten how reassuring he could be. Her parents were understandably worried about her and wondered if she was stressed. Samuel caught Piper in a room. He was a huge man, stocky, tall and fearless. He was very jolly and larger than life. Most of the people at the synagogue thought he was very much like Brian Blessed. He sat down on her bed and patted her next to him. Piper awkwardly sat down. "Don't take this the wrong way, darling, but I overheard you and Aza talking. What happened?" Sam put his arm around her. Piper made some noises before bursting into tears and nuzzling into her father's shoulder. It's all right. Don't worry." Piper always saw him as a great bear, what with his chestnut brown hair and great bushy beard, who could always make you feel better with a giant hug. "Are you angry, Dad?" Piper asked. "No, darling. Your mother and I had you when we were 20, and you're 20 now. So really, well, I don't mind. I do worry about you, though." Piper put her arms around her father and gave him a hug. Piper began to calm down. "What are you worried about?" Sam whispered into her ear. I think I've caught something, like an STD. Piper lied back in a whisper. Sam froze. He began breathing heavily and suddenly became quite sweaty. He suddenly squeezed her. Never in my life did I think my little girl would get something like that. I don't fucking care what your mother says. I'm taking you to the sexual health clinic tomorrow. Piper felt something cold in her head and saw he was crying. Dad, it's just a speculation. It could just be my period. Now, Piper Rosenthal, you are going to the clinic tomorrow, and that's final. Sam stood up and said another prayer over her in Hebrew and kissed her on the forehead. She had been ordered by her bombastic father to sit in and do nothing all day. Her phone was on full charge, and so that was all right. Piper realised she was still wearing her clothes for travelling in. She stayed in, watched Netflix all day. It was all right. She hadn't done this kind of thing in years. As the sun set, she became worried. She was finishing a movie on TV when Madeline came into the room. "Hello, Maddie," Piper greeted her younger sister. Madeline walked over towards her sibling and hugged her before quietly saying, "I missed you." It warmed Piper's heart. "Did Asa tell you to say that?" Piper asked. Madeline smiled. "No, silly. I did. I love you," she said in that caring, youthful manner that children have an ability to do. "Why, thank you, Maddie. I love you too." Piper kissed Maddie on the forehead. "Go on, hop off," she added. Madeline skipped off to bed happily. Her parents came down and kissed her goodnight while her siblings went to bed. She went into her bedroom and fell backwards onto the bed, reflecting on the day. She didn't know why the salad of greens were making her sick or why she had increased stamina, not that it wasn't unwelcome. Piper pulled out her cell phone. 3 missed calls and a few messages, one of which was from Danny. It read, "Full moon tonight. Stay in. Stay safe." Piper gasped. That was the thing she hadn't remembered. It was 11 p.m, and so the full moon was well out. Piper went to close her blinds, and before getting caught up, she saw the moon. She took it in, basking in its light. She didn't know what to think of it, whether she could close her curtains and be done with it, or stay and watch the moon. Perhaps her eyes hadn't adjusted to the light, but after she had blinked a few times, it hit her. Like the pressure of being hit by a train, she collapsed on the floor. "Oh no!" she croaked. She desperately reached for her phone and struggled to unlock it. She had to call Danny. He had to know what to do. The dial rung and rung. And then Danny's voice came on. "I'm fucking turning!" she screamed down the line. Danny sighed. "Get outside. Get into the wilderness. Pray you can hold on." Piper gasped as the sharp pain hit her diaphragm. "Oh God, help me, Danny!" she croaked. "Like I said, get outside," he replied calmly. Piper forced herself up and pulled on her Converse shoes. She limped out of her room. She stood on her full feet and stretched. And then the door to Asa's room opened. Piper's 14-year-old brother stood in the doorway, looking at her. Piper screamed as her back arched with excruciating cracks. Her skeleton expanded, making her clothes painfully tighter. Asa's mouth dropped open. "Oh my God, you were right! You were fucking right!" His voice wavered in terror, and he shook his head in disbelief. Piper panted and fell on her knees in front of him. Her nails ached, and she felt a great pressure overtake them. Her hands were shaking, and as she held them up to her face, her nails exploded off, revealing sharp claws. Asa was paralysed with fear and not moving. "Go back inside, Asa, please," Piper begged. Asa didn't move. Piper continued panting and ripped her jacket off. "Asa, listen to me. Go back inside now, please," she shouted, desperate to get her brother to listen. Asa, again, didn't move. Piper, realising that she was wasting time in persuading him, gave up and dashed downstairs as the parents stirred from their bedroom. Danny was still on the phone. "Who was that?" he asked. "What do I do? I can't have my parents see me like this. My brother's just found out and he'll tell Mum and Dad, and—" Piper breathed in a panicked tone. "Shut up!" Danny interrupted abruptly. "Why the fuck did you come home knowing that the full moon was in 2 days, huh?" he added sternly. Piper felt faint. I wasn't thinking straight. I haven't seen my parents for a month. Just tell me what to do and be done with it. Piper heard footsteps coming from upstairs and her father's distinct voice saying, Maddie, get up. Something's wrong with Piper. We're going to drive her to the hospital. Oh shit, my parents are coming. Piper scrambled to the front door, put her fingers around the lock. Get out now. You have about 10 minutes if you can fight the change. Someone's life may depend on it. Are you near any forests? Danny asked smoothly. Yes, was all Piper could squeeze out before a new pain overtook her. Her hands began to stretch and grow, causing her to drop the phone. It smashed on the ground, cracking the screen. Piper? Piper, are you still there? Fuck, I've lost her. Danny sounded panicked. Piper scrambled to reach her phone, unable to pick it up with her comically stretched palms. She tapped the speaker and yelled down the line, Is that it? Is there anything else? She gasped. Indistinct voices could be heard down the line. Danny's voice came back. There's nothing else I can do. He sounded sad. Please stay on the line with me. You have no idea how much I need you. Piper begged. Listen, if I stay on the line with you, then your parents will pick up your phone and cross-examine me over everything. Also, you do know this is all your fault. Yet you're giving me shit for it. Danny's sympathy was replaced by anger. I'm sorry, Danny. I'm sorry for what I've done. Piper began to shake as her hands started to curve and become more wolf-like. Try and hold on. Try and get out. And good luck. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Danny's fury was replaced with a different tone. Pray you don't become one of the lost, he added, and then ended the call. No! Oh shit! Danny, call back! Piper whined as she realised all hope was lost and tried to force the front door open, struggling with her quickly changing hands. She heard her parents coming out of their bedroom and approached Asa. Piper whimpered and forced the door open with all of her strength, bolting through into the cold night air. Her mother started to come down the stairs. Piper scurried across the gravel driveway to the cattle gate at the opening to the road. She got her foot stuck in it and tripped, grazing her elbows and knees, and it was here that she broke down, crying her eyes out in noisy sobs. She felt her feet begin to change, and they ached and began to stretch. Piper could hear her shoes giving way and tearing off. Her bare feet were flexible enough to untangle from the cattle grid. She picked herself up and rested her hands on her father's car, scratching the paintwork and leaving a large scratch on the front passenger's door. Piper could sense her mother was standing in the doorway to the house. And as she looked behind her, she noticed her father was there too, restraining her. Her mother had tears in her eyes and her mouth was open in a silent scream. Piper could feel her spine stretching and screamed in agony as a towel grew from her back. Her butt began to expand and Piper didn't know if it was muscle or flesh. But either way, her jeans were getting too small and they burst off, panties and all. Shaggy, black fur began growing from her bare groin, spreading over her lower body, and Piper stood up completely. She groaned in agony as her feet became completely digitigrade, her soles developing leathery pads. Piper! What are you? Sobbed her mother. Piper took one look. I'm sorry, Mum, she wept. Catherine broke through her husband's grasp, raced towards her daughter. She held back the moment she saw Piper's towel and feet. What the fuck are you? Catherine whispered in terror. She plucked up enough courage to edge forward, and she embraced her pain-ridden daughter. Get away from me! Piper panted as the towel continued getting longer. No! Catherine croaked. Get away from me! Piper yelled. She then threw her mother away with her undisputed strength. Catherine was thrown back with force, hitting her back on the lawn. Feeling that all was lost, she wailed in despair. You will thank me! Go inside, please! Piper wept and turned her back. Her mother's cry degenerated into a scream of anguish. Piper ran down the road, tears running down her cheeks. All that was left of her were her torn shoes, her damaged phone, and the remains of her jeans and panties. She knew where the forest was, and she needed to get there. It was a place where she had so many childhood memories turn into a domain for a werewolf. She ran into the net of trees that collapsed onto the edge of a cliff. She stood out, pondering on whether to do it, to jump, to end it all. No. She had to find a way through this. Piper turned back, ran further into the forest. She tripped over some roots, and she was now certain she was far enough away to finish the transformation. She fell to the ground, and she let everything go. And it began. It started with a crack after agonizing crack as her body began to contort and change. Her ribs felt it the most, her lungs and heart working faster than ever before. Both organs began to grow, and with it, her ribs gave way. They were broken by her new lungs and heart. She gasped sharply, coughing up globules of bloody flesh. She was in too much pain to scream or cry out as her tears fell in heavier quantity. Her ribs began to rebuild themselves to accommodate for the size of her organs. Her stomach began to ache, and she could feel her digestive system moving about in noisy ripples, fitting itself for the diet of a monster. Piper held her face in her hands, pinching herself, hoping it was just a dream. "Why me? For fuck's sake, why me?" she mourned. Why hadn't she asked Danny to pull out? Why did she have to be so set on love that it ruined her life? Piper touched her stomach in an effort to soothe it, but felt a pain in her groin as a pool of blood leaked from between her furry legs. The skin below her waist changed colour, becoming a dark black. Her shoulders broadened, straightening her clothes to such an extent that they began to hurt her. Then, with a relaxing rip, her crop top and bra burst open off of her torso. Piper awkwardly covered her chest with her disfigured hands and began to cry like her life depended on it. And in terror, pain and sadness, the tears fell. She lay at the foot of a tree, naked and changing. Her bottom half was entirely transformed as the muscles in her legs had expanded and strengthened. Piper felt her breasts ballooning out, going up in size. They spread her hands apart and she embarrassedly revealed her bare chest to the forest. And, like she thought with her ass, she didn't know if her now double-sized bosom was muscle or plain flesh. To see Piper Rosenthal like this was indescribable. She was always perfect, even if she hadn't tried. She was pretty, well-dressed, dashing, but to look upon her now would break one's heart. The power of the moon had deformed her into a creature, with bones bulging from her figure, only held in by her thickening skin. She retained her hourglass figure, despite her waist expanding to stay in proportion with the rest of her. Piper began to pray in Hebrew, praying that God would save her, and nothing happened, but the pain in her upper body stopped. For a moment, Piper thought the transformation had ended. She stood on her all fours. She was stiff and had many cramps in her disfigured hands. She didn't believe it, but she thought it had stopped. Piper stood up and groaned in agony. Her entire body was cramped. She wiped her eyes with her hands, but it was painful because her hands had changed so much that it had put them into human positions that felt like death. She stretched out and in the process looked up. She caught the moon and she stared at it. She felt it was teasing her, like it was calling her weak. The change hadn't stopped, and Piper was about to find out the hard way. She collapsed on her all fours. Her teeth began to ache, and they popped out of place one by one. They dropped to their clawed hands. Piper began welling up. "Will this ever fucking end?" She screamed into the sky. She felt her gums bleeding as new, improved fangs tore through the human-sized places. Her stomach began to get engulfed in her black hair. The fur moved its way up to her chest with a more ruffled coat covering her cleavage. The muscles in her torso began to ache as they, just like her legs, moved and changed to suit her new form. Her hands began to ache even further, and they completely changed to wolf paws with painfully elongated fingers. Her arms warped and buckled under deafening cracks of her bones. Piper whimpered. She had no more energy left in her. Her arms grew slightly longer and thickened out, causing her great pain. Her muscles, just like everywhere else at this point, moved and grew to better suit the work her arms would have to do. The fur spread to her arms and covered them, and with her paws developing the same leathery patches seen on her feet. Piper panted and groaned as the final stage in the transformation was about to begin. Her ears suddenly became very hot, and she held her paws to them, only to find that they had grown more pointed and moved further up her head. They, like the rest of her, grew coarse black hair. Her transformation was nearly done, as her neck thickened to make room for more muscle. "No! No! Stop! Stop! I don't want to be a monster! Please make it stop!" Piper screamed in a stupid-sounding lisp due to her oversized teeth. at the top of her burning lungs. There was no stopping it though, and Piper howled in agony as her face pushed forward into a muzzle. Her nose became more dog-like and changed to a wet black. Her muzzle, like the rest of her, became covered in black fur. Her tongue stretched and thinned out. Piper screamed as her voice box and language abilities completely devolved into that of a wolf. While physically she was a monster, the changes hadn't affected her mind, but everything comes in its own time. All she could do was howl and growl, having lost the ability to speak. "I'm not a monster. I'm a human. I refuse to be a monster. I'm Piper Rosenthal. I will hunt, she thought, fighting a losing battle between her instinct and the beast inside. Even now, though, she could feel her mind slipping. She desperately clung to any memory she had, what she had for breakfast, what the last thing Madeline had said to her was, and where she lived. She couldn't find any answers, and discovered she couldn't even remember her own name. She realized she was lost, and bitterly accepted her fate. Her mind was overtaken by the changes, and with it, her violet eyes. Piper pawed at the ground and whimpered as her irises turned to a lupine yellow. The sheer realization that she was no longer herself, spiraling her into irreversible insanity. Despite all this, her black hair stayed the same. It trailed from her head in silky locks, giving her a spectral sense of beauty. And if anyone in the village did see her, then they could recognize that Piper Rosenthal, the girl everyone knew to be kind, polite, well-spoken, would be the one to kill them. Piper was gone. The beautiful girl that stood there minutes ago was nothing more than a feral beast. She had lost the concept of thought and knew only to kill. It was very clear that she was the newest addition to the ranks of the lost. In minutes, she had been turned from a straight-thinking graduate to nothing more than a deranged lunatic. She was clearly never going to be the same ever again. The she-wolf bounded back to the cliff. She stood on her hind legs, releasing a terrifying howl. It echoed throughout the still night, sending chills throughout whoever heard it. The night was hers now. Her stomach rumbled, and the hunt could now begin. The quiet town of Bollington shook under the terrifying noise, spreading unforeseen dread throughout who or anyone who dared to open their eyes. Her family heard it too, and Catherine remained utterly distraught, being comforted by Sam. Madeline was crying in terror in the corner, and Asa stood on the stair, seemingly in a trance, after seeing his sister in a pain-struck state. He had froze, and now, despite being calmed down, he still bare the internal scars of Piper's desperation. He remained quiet and patient. He looked at his anguished mother. "I saw it," he started, with alien calmness. "Piper wasn't human. I could see it in her eyes." His mother looked up. "She hasn't been human for a while. Could you not see it in her behaviour?" His mother's tears still fell, but she made no noise. The poor girl was not nearly strong enough. Asa walked backwards upstairs. She surrendered to the beast within. In the distance, Piper howled, and someone was going to reap the consequences of her denial. The Beast Within. Chapter 2. Missing Person Report. Let's get straight into that. Police investigation into the disappearance of Piper Rosenthal. It all started with what was a missing person report. A simple call that would forever change the British police and caused a public outcry, which still bears no reliable explanation to this day. This, of course, is referring to the disappearance of Piper Rosenthal. It started in the early morning of Sunday, the 18th of August 2019, 1:38 AM to be exact, when a call was made to Cheshire Police. It was reporting a missing person. The voice on the other side was shaky, discernibly female, and around middle-aged. She explained how her daughter had left and that she couldn't fully explain what she had seen. Suspicions were raised on why she didn't call earlier. The following is the entire phone call, unedited. "Operator 999, which service do you require?" Caller. Police, please. Different operator. Cheshire Police, what is your emergency? Caller. I'd like to report a missing person. Operator. Of course, miss. First of all, we must establish who the missing person is. Please give a rough description. Caller. Of course. Her name is Piper Rosenthal. She's around 5'11" with jet black hair and pale white skin. Her eyes are light purple. You mustn't forget that. Keyboard clicks. Operator. Okay. What is your address? Caller. It's address redacted. Operator. Thank you. A squad car should arrive within the next 20 minutes. But please, can you tell me when you last saw her? Caller. She left. She ran away at 11:18 and she ran down the road towards the forest. She wasn't normal. She was a monster. Operator. She ran towards the woods? Caller. Yes, she threw me across the lawn. Operator. Is there any other information to note? Caller. No, it's all right. End of phone call. At 2:02 a.m, 2 police officers, Police Constable Lewis Avery and Police Sergeant Nancy Barrett, arrived at the Rosenthal residence. The identity of the caller was shown to be Catherine Rosenthal. PC Avery searched the property while Sergeant Barrett questioned Mrs. Rosenthal. Another 18 minutes passed before Avery alerted Barrett via radio that he had found something. He asked whether she, Barrett, had a screwdriver on her, to which Mrs. Rosenthal rushed to the garage and found a medium-sized drill. Avery was found knelt on the cattle grid at the opening of the property. He had his eyes fixed on the space below the rods of steel. "One of you, get this thing off," he said. Barrett took the drill off Mrs. Rosenthal and worked on getting the screws off 3 of the girders of the frame. Avery reached in and produced a pair of torn black Converse boots and a shredded pair of blue denim jeans. Upon further inspection, Avery was able to find other parts of jeans, as well as a pair of grey Victoria's Secret panties, torn in half. Avery threw one of the shoes to Barrett, who observed it. "Fucking hell, there's toenails in here," she exclaimed in shock. Avery walked to the car and took out some evidence bags, in which all 3 items were placed in. The 2 officers bade farewell to Mrs. Rosenthal, promising that they would return later, during daylight hours. Barrett and Avery had the clothes sent to a laboratory for examination and settled the case. Another 3 calls were made on the same night, documenting strange occurrences within the town of Bollington, Cheshire. Unfortunately, only one of these calls were made public due to the other 2 containing distressing content. The call that was not redacted was made by a farmer who went by the name of William Blakeman. He claimed that there was a large black mass in one of the fields. This is the full, unedited call. Dial tone. Operator. 999, which service do you require? Blakeman. Police, I suppose. Dial tone. Operator. Cheshire Police, what is your emergency? Blakeman. Yes, hello, listen. I'm more confused than anything else. There's this, giant black shape in the middle of one of my cattle fields. Operator. A shape? Blakeman. Yeah, a kind of tangle of black. I can't tell from this distance. Operator. Okay, sir. May I ask what the other cows are doing? Blakeman. They're all grouped in a herd in the corner. Something's not right. They shouldn't be up at all. There's this infrequent cry coming from them. Just one. Apart from that, they're silent. Operator. A cry? Blakeman. Yeah, that's right. Just like when a mother can't find her calf. It's exactly like that. Operator. Do you possess a firearm, sir? Blakeman. Yes, just one. A 12-gauge shotgun. Operator. I may remind you that you are authorized to use your firearm on an object that's causing your livestock stress. Blakeman. Of course. Sound of creaking, and then cocking of shells, and then the door opening. Operator. Sir? Has the object moved at all? Blakeman. No, wait. Hang on. Operator. What is it? Blakeman. It's just looking at me, with bright yellow eyes. It's not moving. It's just looking at me. Shotgun fires, loud growl, and then stumbling before slamming the door. Operator. Sir? Sir, are you okay? Blakeman. Pants in his hurt. I shot it. It flinched and then ran at me. I'm looking out my window now, but there's nothing there. Operator. Do you want me to send an officer to survey the property? Blakeman. No, but thanks for your time. Operator. Lock your doors and windows, and do not go outside. A squad may drop by during the day. Blakeman. Thanks. End of call. At 2:45 p.m. on Sunday, August the 18th, 2019, Sergeant Oliver Hassan and Police Constable Lewis Avery went to the Rosenthal property for a second time. This time, they brought recording gear with hopes to interview a member of the household. This time, the door was answered by a medium-sized boy with shoulder-length black hair and blue eyes. He identified himself as Asa Rosenthal and looked visibly shaken. He coldly invited the officers inside. They settled themselves down and summoned Catherine. Asa followed suit, and the police asked to conduct an interview, which was accepted. This is the full interview, unedited. Hassan. This is about Piper Rosenthal, going missing. Before we start, may I ask your relationship with her? Mrs. Rosenthal. I'm her mother. Mr. Rosenthal. Younger brother. Hassan. Thank you. Now, may I ask, when did you last see Piper? Mrs. Rosenthal. I saw her when she came out of her room at around 11:15 p.m. I came out of my room because I heard screaming. She was crouched on the floor and begged me to go inside. I blacked out from fear. Mrs. Rosenthal. She pushed me across the front garden and she... Mrs. Rosenthal began to cry at this point and was unable to respond to any further questions. Hassan. Was she all right during the day? Mr. Rosenthal. She had been feeling sick and told me she'd had sex with a boy at a college, which is where it all started. Hassan. Which college, if you don't mind me asking? Rosenthal. Oxford University, Lincoln College. She was roommates with a girl, Lydia. Her surname is something Eastern European, and stayed there for 3 years. Hassan. Oxford? Rosenthal. Yeah. Hassan. Was there anything else? Rosenthal. Don't think so. Mrs. Rosenthal. The squad that came by earlier found torn clothes in the cattle grid. Avery. When we analyse the samples, we'll let you know, but for now, we can't be too sure on whose it was. Mrs. Rosenthal. Oh, for fuck's sake, they're Pipers. Who else would they be? Avery. We'll let you know. Mr. Rosenthal. Please, excuse my mother. Avery. No problem. Hassan. Is that it? Rosenthal. Yeah, that's it. Hassan. Well, kid, if anything else happens, call the non-emergency and say you need to speak to Sergeant Ollie Hassan. Rosenthal. Will do. Hassan and Avery stand up. Rosenthal. You will find her, won't you? And when you do, make sure she comes here first. Hassan. Don't get your hopes up. Rosenthal. Hang on. He reaches into his pockets and hands them a smashed iPhone 7S. Take this. It's Piper's phone. Avery takes the phone. Avery. Well, we'll come around if we find anything. End of recording. The farmer who called about a disturbance in his field, William Blakeman, and his son Nathan, found a disemboweled, partially devoured carcass of a calf on the field where the shape was reported. Leading away from the body was a set of gigantic paw prints, along with a small blood trail, which disappeared after about 100 meters. No police was summoned, but rumors of a monster began circulating around the children of the town. On Tuesday, August 20th, 2019, 2 officers of Oxford Police, Police Constable Abigail Chelmsford and Sergeant Alfie Wigan went to Lincoln College in hopes of talking to Lydia, Piper's roommate. They inquired at the front desk and were told that Lydia was packing up to leave that very evening. Regardless of this fact, the officers knocked on the door of the apartment upon noticing minor abrasions on the wood. Lydia answered the door with a pair of headphones around her neck. "Oh, shit," she groaned. "If you're going to search me, promise you'll pack my stuff back up after taking it all out." The officers entered her dorm room and sat down on her couch. Lydia awkwardly sat opposite them. The officers asked Lydia about interviewing her, which she agreed to. Start recording. Lydia: "I've been in this country for 4 years, and already I get in shit with the police." Wigan: "You're not in trouble. It's about Piper. She's gone missing." Lydia: "Missing? Like you cannot find her?" Wigan: "It's been 2 days, and we thought it would be better if we talked to you, as you were the last person who may have known anything." Lydia: "She fucked Danny Adams, then got sick from it." Wigan: "Who's Danny Adams?" Lydia: "Quite a pretty boy. Was just about every girl in university once." Wigan: "And you say Piper was with him?" Lydia: "She told me she was going to fuck him, and then she did, and then she got sick. He tried to see her at 3 in the morning too." Wigan turns to face Chelmsford. Wigan: "That explains the cracks on the door, Abby." Chelmsford: "What were Piper's symptoms?" Lydia: "She had a headache, then a violent stomach upset, and then blurred vision and muscle aches." Wigan: "Thank you." Lydia: "What? Was she poisoned?" Wigan: "I think it's something a bit worse." Lydia: "Now, when did you last speak to Piper?" Lydia: "The last time I spoke to Piper was probably the day before she left. I told her about Danny showing up in the early hours, and she looked shocked. She was slightly tearful and told me that if he came back, I was to call the police. Piper hugged me goodbye and left. Danny came by later that afternoon." Wigan: "Danny Adams?" Lydia: "Mm-hmm. He said he was going to talk to Piper and forced his way inside. I told him she had left, and he looked at me. I swear down, I thought he was going to kill me. He asked me where she was going, and I told him she was on the train out of Oxford. He demanded I tell him where she lived. I refused. I braced myself for a punch or two, but he screamed in anger and left. He must have really needed to talk to her, because before he left, he told me that if Piper goes missing, it ain't his fault." Chelmsford: "Fucking psycho." Wigan: "Where is he from, Lydia?" Lydia: "Somewhere in North London. I think near Camden Market." Wigan: "Abby, tell them Met." Chelmsford leaves the room. Lydia: "Are you done with me now?" Wigan: "Pretty much. You're done." Lydia: "You will tell me if you find anything, won't you?" Wigan: "We'll try." Lydia: "If it's in the next week, I'll be all right, but if not, send a letter to Vilnius Central PO." Wigan: "We'll try. Thank you, Miss Catalini." End of recording. The Metropolitan Police Service was informed about Danny Adams on August 20th, 2019 by Police Constable Abigail Chelmsford. Sergeant Oliver Hassan was relocated to London to assist the Detective Inspector Charlie Lancaster, the detective tasked with finding Danny and Piper, should she show up in Greater London. Information to note: D.I. Lancaster is 24 years old but has risen through the ranks in 3 years, and despite his young age has a head full of white hair. He also has a minor defect in one eye. The pupil is shaped like a star while the iris is dark orange. 20th of August 2019. Piper Rosenthal's phone decoded and messages call history and audio of calls collected. 21st of August 2019. First news coverage. BBC 6 p.m. news. At Oxford University graduate has been confirmed missing by Cheshire Police this morning. Image of Piper appears on screen. Piper Rosenthal was last seen leaving her family residence at 11:18 p.m. on the 18th and has not been seen since. Our Cheshire correspondent, Fergus Brooke, reports. Thin Scottish gentleman appears on screen. Yes, as it appears that Piper was last seen entering the wooded area close to midnight on Sunday, and police identified 3 items of her clothing within a cattle grid. According to Oxford Police, Rosenthal has recently been violently ill and stressed for the final few days at Oxford University, according to her roommate Lydia Catalini. Cheshire Police are listing her disappearance as suicide, while public rumours display cult activity. Unfortunately, this is all they know. Fergus Brooke, BBC News. Cuts back to studio. Thank you, Fergus. And in other news, 22nd of August 2019. Police searches involve body bags. D.I. Lancaster and Sergeant Hassan were given images of both Daniel Adams and Piper Rosenthal, caught together on CCTV and solo portraits. They were given free rein of London in order to find Danny, who, at this moment, was the number 1 suspect. The officers were deployed with plain clothes and went to Camden Market. They caught Adams exiting a cafe and followed him home. He was oblivious to their presence, and the officers changed into uniform before knocking on his door. Adams was nonchalant when communicating with the officers. He was very defensive when the officers were asking to interview him. Eventually, he agreed. Start recording. Hassan. Right, where's she gone? Because I think you know. Lydia Catalini certainly thinks so. Adams. Fucking bitch. Hassan. In other words, Mr. Adams, Piper Rosenthal was missing, and it's a wired notion that you may have something to do with it. Adams. Sure, I slept with her. And then she forced me to stay in. She got sick and gave me shit for everything. Hassan. And what about Lydia? Adams. What about her? Hassan. You tried to get with Piper forcefully, then threatened Lydia. Adams. Whatever. Hassan. May I just inform you that entering someone's property without their permission is a violation of the law. Adams. Pfft, what else was I supposed to do? She needed to listen to me because I was the only other person who could tell her the facts. Hassan. Adams, tell me what you know. Adams. Piper met with me on Friday the 17th. She slept with me and left. She felt sick the next day. I offered my help. This wasn't just a casual bug. This was more than that. This was life-threatening. Hassan. And in all this time, you didn't think of talking to a doctor? Adams. I was told Piper took a morning after pill, and then it died down. The last I talked to her was the night she went missing. Lancaster. Lies! Adams. Huh? Lancaster. You were talking to her. About what? Adams. I just said I was sorry for everything, and I hope she'd forgive me. Lancaster. Really? Adams. Yeah. Lancaster. Well, Piper seemed to be in quite a bit of pain during that conversation. Adams. Pfft, beats me. Lancaster. Tell me this, Mr. Adams. What exactly are the lost? Adams. What do you want about, Detective Inspector? Lancaster slams fist onto table. Lancaster. You know what I'm talking about. Stop playing the innocent. Adams. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Lancaster. Try me. This wouldn't be the first time I've dealt with someone like this. Adams. Piper has been given a condition by me. Lancaster. Let me guess. Bipolar disorder? Adams. A little worse than that. Lancaster. Lycanthropy? Adams. Let's just say it's the physical equivalent. Lancaster. We've heard enough. End of recording. 23rd of August 2019. Cheshire Police turn attention to the forest where Piper Rosenthal was last reported. By the 24th, they had made a shocking discovery. Second news coverage. BBC, 6 p.m. News. Piper Rosenthal, the Oxford University student who went missing 5 days ago, has still not been found. But earlier this morning, Cheshire Police made a shocking discovery. Our Cheshire correspondent, Fergus Brooke, reports. Please note, this may be disturbing for some viewers. Thin Scottish gentleman returns to the screen. Yes, this morning, with the 94-acre forest of Bollington Cheshire, police forces found teeth, torn clothing, and old blood belonging to one Piper Rosenthal, the university student who went missing on Sunday. Inspector Rawlinson of the local police department has issued a statement saying that they will find whoever has committed this brutal act. The items were found under a patch of leaves when a dog walker saw his beagle sniffing against it before kicking away the covering. This new evidence is shocking, but at the same time brings us closer to whoever murdered her. Public notion is that Piper was murdered, causing outcry from the public. The case went silent until late September, and despite Detective Inspector Lancaster trying to get Danny Adams convicted, his case was dropped due to lack of evidence. Sergeant Oliver Hassan was repositioned back to Cheshire. Asa Rosenthal, Piper's brother, is contemplating suicide. September 2019. A 999 call, unlike any other, was received by Cheshire Police. The caller was confident and claimed she had seen the previously thought to be dead Piper Rosenthal. She claimed that she had found her stumbling around outside like she was drunk, covered in blood, and completely naked and freezing cold to the touch. She said that she and her husband had carried her in just as the sun was setting, and that she appeared to be completely dazed and confused. For a moment the call was hopeful, before it took a horrifying turn. Unedited call. Operator. 999, which service do you require? Caller. Police, please. Dial tone. Operator. Cheshire Police, what is your emergency? Caller. Hi, so, do you know that girl who went missing a month ago? Operator. Piper Rosenthal? Caller. Yeah. Well, I think I found her. Operator. Her body or... Caller. No. This is going to sound really weird, but she's alive. Operator. We'll send a squad car and an ambulance. But can you please tell me your address? Caller. Sure, it's... Address redacted. Operator. Alright, I've got 2 officers on the way, but it's pretty far out. Could you just first check inside her mouth? Caller. I'll try to, but she's absolutely covered in blood and was being aggressive when we put a blanket on her. Operator. She's covered in blood. Keyboard clicks. Caller. Yeah, like head to toe. It's mainly on her arms, breasts, mouth, but there's a hell of a lot in her hair, and all over her, really. Operator. Miss, can you check and see if her teeth are all there? Caller. Okay, sure. They're all there. Operator. Fuck me. And her toenails? Caller. All there? Keyboard clicks. Caller. We tried to question her earlier, but she was completely out of it. She refused to respond, and when we tried to give her something to drink, she swatted it away. Operator. So how did you find her? Caller. I went outside for a cigarette when I noticed bloody footprints all over the driveway. Then I found her. She was stumbling around outside like she was drunk. We carried her in and she was freezing. We asked for her name and she simply said in a rough, calm voice, "Well, who the fuck do you think I am?" We were among the people who thought she was dead. Operator. I see. Sergeant Hassan, who has spent a lot of time on this case, is on his way. Caller. Well, Piper said nothing. She's just sitting there, waiting, with her eyes dead fixed on the window. Operator. Just stay calm, miss. The officers will be there in 6 minutes. Caller. Wait. Operator. What are you seeing? Caller. This huge smile appeared on Piper's face. Operator. A smile. Caller. Yeah, this huge fucking smile ripped across her face. Something's not right. Operator. What is she looking at? Caller. She's looking at the moon. Blood-curdling scream is then heard. Caller. Holy shit! Operator. What is it? Caller. Oh my fucking god! What the fuck? Operator. What are you seeing? Excuse me, miss, what are you seeing? Caller. She dropped the blanket. She's on the ground. She's convulsing on the ground. Operator. Could it be a seizure? Caller. Oh my god! Operator. What is it? Caller. She's Luke, run! Footsteps are then heard. Operator. Miss, what happened? Caller. Jesus, Luke! Barricade the door! Operator. Miss, what's happening, miss? Caller. Piper started changing. We ran, and then all I could hear were the cracks and groans. She's screaming and crying down there. We barricaded the door, and now... Massive crash is then heard. Caller. She's here. How far away are the officers? Operator. They're minutes away. Just try to hold on. Caller. Luke, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. Crash and then splintering of wood is then again heard. Ah! The line went dead. The officers, PC Lewis, Avery and Sergeant Hassan, arrived 28 seconds later to the sound of blood-curdling screams and growls coming from the upstairs room, before a young woman appeared at a window, bashing at it with tears streaming down her cheeks, and she was violently grabbed away, and a blood-curdling scream erupted from the room. Blood splashed the window, and the officers were forced to take cover as the top half of the same woman was thrown through the window, sending shards of glass everywhere. Avery, call for backup! Hassan yelled as he ran into the house. Avery, call for backup! Hassan yelled as he ran into the house. He yelled a brave cry, and Avery could see his shadow in the room upstairs. He held a camera up and snapped a photo. The brief flash startled whatever was in there, causing it to jump from the window with terrific speed. It bounded past Avery's position and dashed into the woods opposite the house. The face of Oliver Hassan appeared in the doorway as he stumbled out into the porch. He violently vomited and collapsed onto the ground, sobbing. A few moments after PC Avery called for backup, an ambulance arrived. The driver stepped out, accompanied by another paramedic. I think you're too late, Avery quietly mumbled. What the hell happened? Asked the first paramedic. Avery pointed to the quivering sergeant. He knows, but he might not be in the mood. Avery pointed to the mutilated torso of the woman. Make us start with that, he said. Police backup arrived 7 minutes later. Hassan was still crying when they arrived. One of the officers walked away towards Avery. What happened? He asked. It was pretty brutal. Avery pointed towards Hassan. Ollie! He shouted. Sergeant Hassan stood up and stumbled over. The officer looked at him. We need to see what's up there. Sergeant, he asked. Sergeant Nancy Barrett appeared behind him. I ain't going back up there. Hassan shuddered. He was visibly shaken. Sergeant Barrett, PC Avery, and one of the paramedics trooped off into the house. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found next. The door to the master bedroom was shattered, with an arm having been thrown at the opposite door, leaving a pool of blood in the hall. There was a small barricade made from a dresser on the inside of the room, and the walls were splattered with blood. Barrett had climbed over the dresser and peeked inside. She threw up. The paramedic was next in, and he gasped. On the bed was the disemboweled corpse of what used to be a man. His head was smashed into a wall on the other side of the room, and there was a bottom half of another body on the ground, with parts of the intestine still inside. A smashed phone was also there, and the bed was soaked in blood, as was the floor and most of the walls. It confirmed to most that this wasn't a normal crime scene. No human could have done this within the space of a minute. Hassan's photo was developed and showed a disturbing sight. And a large, humanoid black wolf was crouched over the body that had been ripped in half. Its eyes were bright yellow, and it was staring into the camera. The flash from the camera forced it out into the night. It survived a 5-meter drop and could still bound incredibly quick. Oliver Hassan was locked in a delirious state for 3 days, and it took CSI 3 weeks to clean the scene up. Detective Inspector Lancaster heard about the event mere minutes after backup arrived. His vast intelligence worked to provide a solution. Take blood samples from the footprints. He commanded a forensic team present. They did as they were asked, and identified the blood to be Piper Rosenthal's. Lancaster also went back to Danny Adams' house to collect a blood sample. He took 2 samples, both placed into vials. He poured them into separate dishes and put them under a microscope. He noticed something. Both blood samples had strange black strands infrequently running through them. He asked many doctors, but none of them could find a diagnosis. 17th of September, 2019. Detective Inspector Lancaster ordered an armed police unit to seize Daniel Adams. His trial was set for the 15th of November. The charge, knowingly infecting another with a STI and conspiracy to commit murder. To the Rosenthal family, at least, the brutal murder brought one hope to them. Piper Rosenthal was not dead. PC Avery and Sergeant Barrett took off into the forest where Piper was said to be the next morning. They used motorbikes and followed large paw prints in the ground. And despite this, they never found her. Piper, it seemed, had disappeared off the face of the earth. That was until the 24th of September, when Piper was spotted by CCTV, fully clothed and clean, boarding a train to Glasgow. This was the last anybody saw of her. She was never heard from again, and in the Highlands, farmers occasionally report cattle having been torn apart. But police cannot find a verdict. The Piper Rosenthal case was immensely covered up by the government, which led to much criticism from the public. Daniel Adams still awaits trial. This case is unsolved, and while it has been officially closed, with the official verdict as Piper being murdered, Detective Inspector Charlie Lancaster has sworn to follow the case until he finds Piper Rosenthal. The Creatures of the Night. The Beast Within. Chapter 3. Let's get straight into that. 25th of September, 2019. The body of a 22-year-old girl was found, naked and with her head smashed in with a rock by the side of a stream, some miles outside Bollington, Cheshire, United Kingdom. Her wallet was also taken, but her credit cards and phone had been left behind. Police could not find a verdict, but many believed that Piper Rosenthal, a girl that had been previously thought to be dead, had popped up at a train station the day before, was responsible. These reasons came from the fact that the bare footprints were found leading towards the body, and bloody handprints were found on the underside of the rock used to kill the female. A day later, Charlie Lancaster woke up at his desk. He had a small pile of police reports being used as a pillow, and his black trench coat lay over his chair. A cold coffee lay untouched on the coaster. Charlie groaned. His neck ached from sleeping in a jaunty position, and he looked at his watch. 6:53 a.m. He sighed and rubbed his eyes. He'd been working overtime these past few days, ever since the couple were brutally murdered on the last full moon. His close friend, Oliver Hassan, was locked in shock, and the primary culprit, Danny Adams, was locked in police custody. The door at the end of his small office opened, and Sergeant James Clark appeared. "Morning," Charlie grunted. He kept his defected eye on the sergeant. James settled himself onto the chair on the other side of the desk. "I've been on the phone with Inspector Hawthorne. You know, the bloke up in Glasgow. And he says they checked all the CCTV at the station for the 24th, and they interviewed all the ticket inspectors for the train from Chester, and they came to a conclusion." James had a hint of excitement in his voice. He handed Charlie a document filled with interview papers. "They couldn't find Piper. She never showed up in Glasgow. We think that the farmers in the Highlands were lying about their cattle being slaughtered for media attention." Charlie's heart leapt. If Piper wasn't in Scotland, then he was still authorised to find her. He stood up. "Tell the boys in Northumbria to check the cameras in every station on that route." He picked up his coat and coffee. "Where are you going?" James asked. "I'm going to go talk to Danny Adams," Charlie replied before he left his office, leaving James alone. Charlie reached West Hampstead police station at 8 a.m. He took the front desk by surprise, but was able to ask for interviews with Danny Adams. He was escorted to Danny's cell and entered alone. He had brought a small amount of recording equipment and was hoping to interview Danny again. Unlike the last time, Danny was more cooperative. Charlie sat down and pressed the record button. "I apologize for your arrest, but you must remember that you are the prime suspect," he started. "But I haven't killed Piper, or attacked her, or anything," Danny groaned. He jolted his head across the room and sighed. "Well, I know you haven't killed her, but I have a reason to believe she is heading to London." Charlie flipped through a few of the papers he had brought with him and pointed to the interview sheets. "Why? Why would she come down to her?" Danny asked, in seeming fear. Charlie chuckled. "Lydia Catalini said that the last thing you said to her in the flesh was that you lived in London," he said. Danny raised an eyebrow. "Piper was seen boarding a train to Glasgow, but got off before reaching there," Charlie added. "So you think she's coming to London?" Danny finally spoke up. Charlie cracked his knuckles. "Think about it. Who do you think she hates the most out of everyone?" Danny shrugged. "Me?" "Exactly. And she knows where you live, not to mention that it's been plastered all over the news where you are now." Danny shuddered and put his face in his hands. "So she's after me?" he mumbled. "Yes. Well, what do you expect me to do?" "What? What are you going to do?" Charlie put the papers back into his folder. "I'm working on it, Mr. Adams." Danny suddenly grabbed the detective's hand. "But you don't know what she's capable of. If you think she threw her mother across the yard, the girl was too powerful." "I'm working on it." Charlie shook off Danny's sweaty palm. He pressed the button of the recording machine and turned it off. "Have you had time with your solicitor?" Charlie asked. Danny looked at him. "Yes." Charlie smiled. "I hope you realize, just because we're cooperating to find your fuck buddy, I'm still getting you convicted." Charlie scoffed and left the room. Charlie felt slightly good about himself as he left the police station. He had successfully told Danny about Piper and had refreshed his own memory of events. He lit a cigarette after leaving the building and took a few puffs at it as he began walking down the street towards the bus stop, when he heard a quick footstep coming up from behind him. It was James. He looked out of breath and he was panting. He had a few pieces of paper in his hands and he was frantically pushing them towards the detective. "The boys found something. Charlie, they found her. In Manchester. Oh, Piccadilly," James hoarsely said. Charlie looked over the papers. The first showed a crowd coming from the train, heading through the ticket checkers. A face in the crowd was circled, and Charlie focused in on it. It was unmistakably Piper's, but she was wearing an eerily calm and happy face. The tracksuit she was wearing was identical to the one the girl who was murdered was wearing. Charlie took a hard puff on a cigarette and spat into a bin. He coughed a few times as he hadn't been smoking for long when he snatched the papers from the sergeant. He grabbed his friend's radio. "It's D.I. Lancaster. Get a squad to Manchester Piccadilly, quickly." "Of course. I want you to tell me if anything happens." "Well, text them then." "Ah, for God's sake, this is bloody urgent." "I don't care if this is in Cheshire's jurisdiction." "Just call them up." "Fine then. Pick me up." Charlie handed James the radio back. A mother and a child who were also at the bus stop looked nervously at Charlie. A Metropolitan police car on patrol showed up. The officer driving noticed them and beckoned them in. The two police officers got into the car and Charlie ordered the driver to take them to HQ. Charlie explained the situation and frantically dashed out of the car when they turned up at Scotland Yard. Charlie tripped over his coat before staggering through the entrance. He raced through reception and ran flight after flight of stairs and knocked on the door of the chief inspector. C.I. David Miller answered the door. "Detective Lancaster?" he asked. "Sir, they found her. They found Piper Rosenthal in Manchester," Charlie panted gruffly. "Detective Lancaster, come, take a seat, and then explain it to me." Miller welcomed Charlie in and closed the door behind him. "Charlie," Miller set out a chair for the detective, and Charlie took it. "Sir, they found her," he panted. Miller looked at him. "I know, but my question is, How would you expect the Cheshire lot to listen to us?" And Charlie looked at his superior, his defected eye working like a somewhat cybernetic organ. "Because Sergeant Oliver Hassan works up there. He was there at the massacre. He took the photograph of whatever was in there. He knows me." He sounded calm. Miller turned his back and faced his window. "I remember when you first came into this room. A mere constable, a 19-year-old boy who wanted to make his mark on the world." Charlie looked intently at the senior officer. "Sir, I want to send the squad to find Piper in Manchester." He spoke up. Interrupting Miller's monologue, Miller turned around and looked at him. "Why do you think we should do that?" Charlie scoffed at the question. "To apprehend her. We need her to provide evidence of Adam's trial." "Come off it, Charlie. You can't seriously think that you have any evidence to get that boy convicted." Miller creased a smile. "As I was saying, sir, Piper is also viable for criminal charge." The detective breathed. Miller placed his fist on the desk. "You think that whatever Sergeant Hassan found in that room was Piper?" He looked coldly into Charlie's eyes. Charlie combed through the folder he had in his hand. He produced both the image of the creature in the bedroom, which the couple had been murdered in, and a photograph of Piper. He showed them to Miller. "Look at the similarities," he said. Miller stared at the images and pointed his fingers at only the similarity he could notice. "All they have in common is black hair." He looked at Charlie. "But take into account that this is close to where Piper was last seen, and Piper was reported to have entered the property, and the blood the team found was hers, and the boys in CSI found teeth belonging to her in the downstairs lounge. I am well aware of the CSI report, Charlie, but it's ludicrous to think that that girl is that thing." Miller slid the pictures back to the detective. "Just talk to Manchester. Get them to send a squad to find her." Charlie sighed. Miller sat down. "Very well, Charlie, but remember, if you cock this up, if this is a big misunderstanding, you can count on facing a tribunal." Miller picked up the phone on his desk. "Go home. Get some rest. You may need it for the results." And Charlie nodded. "Thank you, sir." And he left the room, a triumphant spell of glee ripping through him. Now she didn't know where she was going, and she needed to get to London. That was where Danny was, and she needed help. She was what she was. Lost. That's what Danny said she was, and she rolled her tongue around her mouth. There was still a little bit of blood there, but it was getting old. She would need some more soon. It was awfully crowded. Why was everyone giving her that strange look? Hang on. There was a newspaper next to her, and she read the front cover. "Search for missing girl continues." Wait. That was her face. That was her. That was... Wait. No. She needed to get out of here. That's right. One step after another. Forward. And she was going into the alley. Then no one could see her. So many faces looking at her. She didn't like it. Wait. Someone was calling her name. A male voice. A man. Why was he calling her name? Piper Rosenthal? Was that her name? Maybe they would forget about her if she disappeared. She would walk into the alleyway, and there we go. Into the alley. Now she could turn around and see. Some police officers. Why were police officers looking for her? Oh, now she remembered. She had killed that girl. Well, maybe she'd killed someone, but she'd killed many people. She hardly thought a young adult would matter. But now what? The two officers were looking at her, approaching her with looks of disgust. Hang on. Was she being arrested? Her mouth was speaking now. I haven't done anything. That was all right, good girl. Play it cool. But it wasn't working. They were closer now, and they were taller than her. They were arresting her now? Yes. They were putting her hands in cuffs. No, this wasn't going to happen so easily. She grabbed one of the officers by the throat, her cuffed hand grabbing his fist, preventing him from fighting back. And there we are. She grabbed tighter and tighter, and then she felt herself crick, and he fell to the ground, dead. How sudden, how amusing. She was feeling something in her stomach, moving throughout her body, before she began to laugh. How funny that a strong, tough officer could be killed by a mere weakling. She was feeling something more than that though, and hummed in a sadistic tone. The other officer struck her with a baton. Ow! That hurt. She couldn't allow such a dangerous individual to mill around on these streets. The officer went in to strike again, but she was ready. She grabbed the hard material tightly and broke it in half. She was feeling even more, well, what was the word? Happy? She gripped the officer's wrist tightly and twisted it completely around, silencing her screams and feeling her bones break under the pressure. She was suddenly feeling hot. Was she nervous? No, this wasn't nerves. She anchored her foot on the officer's boot, and she was too hot. The officer struggled, but realized it was pointless and stopped resisting as she grabbed her neck and twisted it to such an extent that she was amazed it hadn't snapped. But it did. As she sat down next to the two bodies, her stomach rumbled, and she realized she hadn't eaten for a while. But she couldn't eat humans like this. She'd feel sick. She needed to transform before she could eat humans. The girl pondered, and she was hungry though. By God, she was starving. Charlie shut his eyes open. His phone was ringing, blaring louder than it should have been. And Charlie sat up in his bed and reached over to his bedside table. His fiancée Abigail batted a hand over to him to try and get him to lie back down. He threw her off. He picked up his vibrating phone and blinked a few times. It was James. He answered the call and put the phone to his ear. What is it? Did they catch her? He asked. There was heavy breathing on the other end. The two officers that went to stop her are dead, James replied shakily. Charlie gasped. Dead? Dead? You're not serious? Charlie asked. I can't describe it over the line. Get to HQ now. James ended the call, leaving only a flat line of static. Charlie got up out of his bed and checked his watch. 4:18 a.m. Charlie groaned and awkwardly got dressed. He picked up his coat and poured himself a coffee, and he sat down at his dinner table and drank it while reflecting on the news. There must have been some mistake. The two officers sent to detain Piper. He couldn't be dead. Charlie looked at his brown liquid in his mug. He took a sip and then downed the entire beverage. He left his house and got in his car and headed into the city centre. There was a hubbub in the station, to say the least. Charlie felt almost alienated as he walked through the small groups of people milling around. James found him and took his wrist. Through here, he told him. Charlie was taken to a small auditorium where a forensics team was sat with a few other officers Charlie didn't recognise. James bussed him into a chair and plopped him down next to him. One of the officers Charlie didn't recognise was sat next to him. He was a thin man with an obvious Arabic descent. He had well-kept black hair and dark brown eyes. Fancy seeing you here again. It was Oliver Hassan, the sergeant Charlie had originally interviewed Danny Adams with. What's the news? Charlie replied. Two officers went to find Piper. They didn't report back. We got a call at midnight saying that some students found the bodies. Hassan was cut off as a serious-looking woman walked into the room. Again, Charlie didn't recognise her. The room stood. The woman walked up to a stand and ordered for the lights to be dimmed. Keep your seats, she said. The room sat down. I am forensic psychologist Dr. Ingrid North. Now, you'll know why I am here. She pressed a button on what looked like a projector controller, and a picture appeared on the screen behind her. It was Piper. Miss Piper Rosenthal disappeared in August. She was then seen yesterday in Manchester. Two officers, Sergeant Thomas Davis and Sergeant Eliza Woodworth, were sent to intervene and detain her. Unfortunately, they did not respond to radio calls an hour later, and an hour after that a call was made saying that two bodies had been found in an alleyway. Dr. North pressed the controller again, and another image appeared on the screen. To say that shock hit the room was an understatement. The forensics team, as usual, were unfazed and were simply taking notes, but the officers on the other side of the room were mostly shocked. Hassan suddenly clenched the table with his left fist and gasped sharply. Charlie wiped his eyes and focused on the image. The two bodies in a police uniform were slumped over next to a dumpster. Both of their necks were limp, and the body on the left had a half of its torso missing, while the other wore a look of absolute terror. There was a lot of blood. Dr. North surveyed the musing officers before settling her eyes on Hassan. Sergeant, "Do you need to take a minute outside?" she asked. Hassan nodded and staggered outside. Charlie raised his hand. "Yes, Detective?" North asked, sternly. "Any information on Miss Rosenthal?" he asked. North flicked through some notes on the stand. She picked out a file. CCTV footage showed her entering the alleyway where the attack took place. The officers follow her in, and she comes out about 10 minutes later. The officers had no money on them when backup arrived. Piper re-entered the train station, and she boarded a train. It's currently unknown where the train is headed. North folded the document up. She looked at Charlie. "Miller told me about you," she frowned. "Weren't you the one that wanted this authorized?" Charlie stared at his feet. He could feel the room looking at him. Hassan walked back into the room, his eyes darting around. He took a seat and nodded to North. "If, as a result of Piper boarding the train, means she's heading to London, I want a vigil to be made at Paddington, St Pancras and Euston. I think I can speak for all of the Met here. I don't want her slipping through again." North flared at Charlie. "And, Detective Lancaster, I don't want any mistakes this time." North picked up her documents and the lights were turned back on. "Dismissed." Charlie looked over at Hassan. "Why did you have her leave, Oliver?" he asked. Hassan turned around. "September 15th. I was the one who took the photo. I was the one who saw the carnage. If it's a similar incident then, it gives me flashbacks," Hassan replied. Charlie nodded. "I need the boys at the stations notified." And Hassan stood up. "May as well start now. If she's boarded another train, she may very well be there now." Charlie's eyes widened. "Shit," he exclaimed. He grabbed his coat and stood up. "Come on." Hassan looked dazed. He walked out of the room, unenthusiastically. And there she was, nearly there. Danny wasn't too far away, was he? Had she even planned on what to do when she found him? No, she'd probably kill him. The train was pulling into the station. It wasn't anything too prestigious, only standard class. Where was this station? London? Euston? Yes, it was Euston Station. She'd been there before, as a child, before she went to Oxford. She'd been to London Euston. It was a nice station, very modern. She may as well take it in. The train was stopping now. She was standing up, walking through the aisle and exiting the train. Many strange looks, lots of stares. That was it. She was plastered all over the news, and now everyone was looking at her. Before the joy of transformation had overtaken her, she may have intoxicated herself with alcohol and relished in the popularity. But now it was somewhat strange. Wait, why were there so many police officers at the ticket gates? There weren't supposed to be this many. She gripped at her wrist. It was aching to pick at her teeth. The last thing she wanted to show in her mouth was blood. The officers were looking at her. They were approaching her, and they were calling her name. "Miss Rosenthal!" They were arresting her again. No! The hand that was approaching her arm was grabbed. She twisted it around and heard a crack echo across the platform. A scream, and various other officers were approaching her. People were running, screaming. She needed to run. She couldn't approach this. She needed to find Danny. And so she barged past the first wave of officers, and people were now running in all directions. She could now blend in. Wait, why was she dizzy? Why was she tripping? Had she slipped on something? She was falling to the ground, and thud. She was breathing heavily. She was aware of multiple bodies around her, and her hands being pulled behind her back. Who are you? Speech escaped her lips. Why was she speaking? She was being picked up, escorted outside, into a fluorescent car. Police? She was bundled in and the door closed. It was here that she felt very tired. Maybe she'd been concussed as she hit the ground. She keeled over onto the back seat as the engine started up, and she was so very sleepy. Charlie was, to say at least, very pleased to himself. Piper had been detained. She was in West Hampstead with Danny, but she hadn't met him yet. She'd probably been taken to a temporary prison before the trial. Charlie was escorted past an interrogation room and into the booth behind the two-way mirror. He was there with both Dr. North and Ollie. A tall woman with a steely gaze stepped into the room, carrying a small file. She sat down on one end of the table, located under a bright light. "Oliver has told me about Piper. He's met her family, and that's why he's here. Before you ask," North looked over at Charlie. "Hello, Charlie," Hassan said friendly. It was at this point when the door opened and a stocky, tall gentleman with thick uniform and a stab vest entered the room, followed by a tall yet thin girl with a pale skin and long black hair. She tottered in and sat down at the table. The gentleman closed the door and stood across it with his massive bulk. Piper looked around the room nonchalantly. She was wearing a khaki jumpsuit, different to the tracksuit she'd been found in. "Hello, Miss Rosenthal," the woman on the other side of the table said. "I am Amelia Naismith, part of the support team in the Met." She held an optimistic stance, and North scoffed. "She's so optimistic that you eventually give in to her," she mused. Piper stared at her. She curled her head slightly. "Hello." Her voice was smooth. Charlie removed his coat and rolled his shirt sleeves up. He placed his fist onto the desk and looked in. "Do you have anything on her mental state?" He looked at North. North shook her head. Charlie looked back at the interrogation. "I'm sure you want to know why you're in here?" Naismith asked. Piper shrugged. "Where's Danny?" she asked. Naismith glared at her. "Danny is in his cell, and we thought that he killed you, but we're obviously wrong," she smiled. Piper exhaled. "I feel dead. I wish he did." She looked sad. "Well, I just want to ask you some questions. Is that all right?" Naismith looked touched by Piper's response. North rolled her eyes. "So, we'll start with the easy questions for now. What is your name?" Naismith looked at Piper, and Piper looked into space for a moment. "My name's Piper Elizabeth Rosenthal. I'm 20 years old." Naismith wrote the answer down on an A4 notebook. "Okay, thank you. Now, how do you know Daniel Adams?" she asked slowly. Piper looked confused. "He was a boy in the university with me, but that's all." Naismith also wrote this down. "Thanks for that. Next question. What happened to you on September the 15th, the last full moon?" she asked, hopefully. Charlie leaned forward, so close that his nose was almost touching the glass. "The joy of transformation." Piper gave a sickly grin. Naismith exhaled before writing this down. "What is the joy of transformation?" she questioned. Piper looked at her like she was the stupidest person on earth. "It is when I can be free of myself from the constraints of this body, where I can metamorphose into the perfect creature." Piper's grin widened. Her eyes looked hungrily at Naismith, and Charlie looked round at Hassan. "Get Adams in here. If anyone asks, say I've authorized it." He spoke up. Naismith pursed her lips and wrote down the answer. "And what is this perfect creature?" she asked. Piper blinked slowly, her long eyelashes partially covered by her hair. "I become what all humans should be. I become what humans are fearful of. I become a combination of beauty." Piper patted her clothed breasts. "And horror." She opened her mouth and picked some dry blood from her teeth. Naismith looked pale. Her hands were shaking as she wrote down Piper's answers. It was at this point in which Hassan returned with a handcuffed Danny. North eyed him up and down. "Well, he certainly looks like a criminal," she mused. "It's okay. You can uncuff him," Charlie said with a hint of compassion in his voice. Hassan nodded and did as he was asked. Charlie beckoned the now free Danny over. He pointed at Piper through the glass. "Is this common with the lost?" he asked. Danny looked at him. His green eyes looked far more dull than when he graduated. "Pretty much," he said. Charlie looked at Naismith. "She looks out of her depth here, Ingrid," he stated. North looked at him, then at Danny. "Send him in." She shot Naismith a glare through the mirror, and Danny sighed. "Jesus," he muttered as Hassan escorted him out of the room. Charlie opened a microphone to make contact with the room. "Amelia Naismith, you are dismissed." He spoke with zero emotion running through his voice. Naismith looked up at the speaker and gathered her things. The guard stepped aside as she left the room. "Piper Rosenthal, you are now going to meet Daniel Adams," he continued. Piper's ears pricked. She looked over to the two-way mirror and winked. Danny entered the room and the guard stepped back across the door. "Hello, Piper." Danny greeted the autonomous girl. Piper rolled her eyes. "Did you have to kill that couple?" he asked. Piper glared at him. "No, but no one said I couldn't," she smiled. Danny just scowled. "I didn't kill them either. I just dismembered them, and then I left." She leaned back against a chair, and Danny made a face. "What are you going to do with me?" he questioned. "I'm going to dismember you as well," she replied, coolly. Danny shrugged. "Go ahead." Charlie chuckled to himself. It wasn't a very good plan, what Danny was going to do. Piper grinned and stood up. The guard perked up. "I could fucking kill you now," she shouted at Danny. She kicked a chair away. "Just fucking watch me." She threw the table aside and lunged at Danny. The guard, at this point, had righted himself and was on his way to break up the fight. Charlie gasped. North stared at him. "She's got a few screws loose, I'll give you that." The guard dragged Piper off of Danny before she could do anything, and Hassan stormed in. "Get her back to her cell," he yelled as he helped Danny up and pulled him out of the room. Charlie looked over at North as Piper was restrained and taken back to her cell. "Shit," she muttered. Charlie looked over the overturned chairs. "I suppose we should save this for the trial," he asked. North angrily looked at him. "What's your case for Adams now?" Charlie exhaled. I'll ask the Old Bailey to drop it. Maybe they can replace him with Piper." North blinked. "Just do them both," she retorted. Charlie nodded. "Very well." Ludmilla Cataline heard her family dog reach the letterbox before she had a chance to get there. A medium-sized envelope lay on the welcome mat. It was addressed to her. She opened it in the hallway. "Dear Miss Ludmilla Cataline, I understand that you were a witness to the acts of Daniel Adams during August, as well as the change in Miss Piper Rosenthal's behaviour during this period. This letter is a request for you to provide evidence at the trial of Daniel Adams at the Old Bailey in London on the 15th of November 2019. If you are unable to make this date, please send your regards at least 2 weeks ahead. Contained in this note is a return flight to London Heathrow, as well as a pass to access a private suite at the Langham Hotel with an indefinite booking, meaning you can stay as long as you wish. I do hope you can make it to the case, as whatever you could say could determine the course of justice. Yours sincerely, D.I. Charlie Lancaster." Ludmilla huffed. She had been back in Vilnius for a mere 2 months, and now she was being shipped back out to London. She may as well go. Piper was her best friend after all. Ludmilla rolled her eyes before walking upstairs and packing her bag. By the time the 15th rolled around, any attempt of interviewing or questioning Piper had become impossible. North was clear that her judgment would be innocent by reason of insanity, and argued that, with many higher-ups, that it was important that she should get the care she needed. Ludmilla arrived in London and spent many hours discussing and documenting her testimonies of the ordeals. Piper's family was also informed about all of the news, and they quickly made their way down to London. Danny spent day after day in meditation, waiting for the trial. Charlie waiting for his opportunity to state his case. Whatever the verdict was, he needed to study this werewolf condition further. It was the 14th. Piper was a day away from her trial for 5 murders and injuring a police officer. Her mind was swimming with hundreds of emotions. Was she meant to feel excited, or nervous, or sad? She didn't know. Piper was lying on her bed in the jail beneath the courthouse. She didn't want to get up. She just wanted to stay here for the rest of time. Her body felt heavy, and she was tired. She felt sick. She wanted to die. There was a heavy knock at the door, and Piper opened her heavy eyelids. The door at the corner of her cell was opened, and Charlie walked in. Piper sat up and blinked. "I don't want to be interviewed by anybody." Charlie stood in the middle of the room. It's all the new systems are asking for these days. She had grown to recognize Charlie. He wasn't a threat. Given that this might be your last night as a free woman, I have been given permission for you to leave your cell. There'll be guards everywhere, but it's the best I can do. He offered a thin smile, and Piper exhaled, before smiling. "My mind appears to have become clearer. You are a good man, Detective Lancaster." Charlie rolled his eyes. He wasn't easily flattered. "I asked ahead for some of your clothes from your home to be brought here. Charlie looked over to the door where Hassan walked in and gave him a package. Charlie walked towards Piper and handed her the small box. "I'll leave you here while you get changed." He turned his back and left the room. Despite his outward and kind actions, Charlie had quite a nefarious plan. His obsession with learning about the werewolf affliction had driven him to extreme lengths, and he had found a brutal solution. There was an expectation that a full moon would be in the sky over the next few days, and Charlie wanted to lure Piper into the city. Armed police would no doubt be summoned, and they would probably shoot the transformed Piper dead, at which point Charlie could have her body examined and further identify various parts of the affliction. He knew it was inhuman, but so was Jenna's smallpox vaccine and Pasteur's chicken cholera cure. Charlie breathed deeply after Piper left the room, dressed in some of her nicest clothes. A pair of black skinny jeans, a light pink vest, and a crop blue denim jacket, and she was wearing a pair of dark green Vans as well. Charlie couldn't help but bite his lip, and Piper had been held in custody for months, and she was clearly excited for this occasion, and Charlie was going to ruin it by having her go through pure agony. He assumed that, after countless psychiatric teams giving her therapy and mind hypnosis, her sadism and insanity may have retracted slightly. Charlie shrugged and picked up his coat, and Piper followed him out of the basement. Though no actual plan had been set up, Charlie wanted Piper to direct the evening. And she was like a child, encouraging the detective to go everywhere. It was only 5 p.m, but the sun was beginning to set, and Charlie smirked. "We might as well go get a coffee," he spoke up. And Piper turned around and looked at him. "Given that we can be out longer that way." Piper nodded and followed him to a pret-a-manger not too far away from where they were standing. It wasn't too busy, and Charlie intentionally chose a seat close to the window. Charlie looked up and spotted the moon. He smiled. Piper looked at him strangely before meeting his gaze. She blinked and then grinned. She pushed the table forward and braced herself. If she had been enthusiastic about the transformation before it began, one could not say the same thing now. Piper screamed through gritted teeth and stood up. The entire cafe looked over to her. Piper began shaking and put her hands to her face and clenched her teeth in agony as her nails floated off her fingers, leaving new claws growing from the bloody places. The same was happening to her feet as her hands began to convulse and grow. It had been months since Piper had turned, and she had long lost the ability to fight the changes. Piper screamed as her hands started to deform and curve, and she fell over as her feet stretched and then tore through her shoes and contorted. Her palms and soles began developing leathery pads, and black fur began sprouting from them. Piper whimpered and tried to stand up again, but to do so was so impossible. She had lost the ability to stand, unless in her feral state, and slipped straight over. Charlie intently watched the transformation unfold as people began backing away and picking up their things to leave. A man came up behind Charlie. "Is she all right, mate?" he asked. Charlie looked at him, a look of giddy excitement on his face. "I don't think so," he replied. The man edged away. Piper screamed again loudly in agony, so much it sent a chill through the almost automation state of Charlie as a towel grew from her spine, shredding through the seams of her jeans. It grew gradually longer to around 1.5 feet. Piper's violet eyes began to well up with tears as her bottom began expanding, and she looked shocked more than anything else, like she forgot how much pain she'd be in because of this. She didn't speak, only looked around in pain. Her eyes said everything. She wanted help, but didn't think anyone could give her any. Piper's legs and towel began growing black fur, and by this point she looked like an absolute wreck. Her eyes were sinking into their sockets, almost as if the transformation was killing her energy reserves.
"Detective, why? What?"
Piper seemed to have discovered what was going on. It seemed that the agony of not turning for nearly 3 months and the work of psychiatrists had done with her had killed any shred of insanity during transformation. And by this point, people were leaving at quite a steady rate. People knew what Piper was, but they didn't want to admit it. Her leg muscles grew and moved around as her bottom half became completely transformed, completely ripping off her jeans. She forced herself out of the chair and up against the wall. Her breasts began expanding, doubling in size, ripping off her vest. So, Your transformation favours you. Charlie crossed her legs.
It just happens.
Piper choked as deafening cracks forced her skeleton to begin growing, as her body gradually changed shape. Her shoulders broadened, leaving her feminine build lost in a buff frame and straining her jacket. Tears began to form in the fabric, and Piper crunched her shoulders, causing the jacket to break into 2 pieces. Piper ripped off the remaining fabric and held half of it up to her eyes as she began sobbing loudly. Fur started growing in all kinds of places as a deafening crack was heard and her chest sagged. Piper gasped sharply.
My ribs!
She moaned. Her chest began to stretch and pulled out, and before it straightened out, she collapsed onto her soft bosom and rolled onto her back as her digestive system changed. Piper stroked her abdomen before groaning again in pain as blood began to appear from between her legs. Charlie grimaced.
It's not meant to go this way, detective. My tits didn't grow until the blood had flowed.
Piper groaned weakly. Fur began growing all the way up her body, reaching her chest and arms.
Detective, get me out of here, please.
Piper was cut off as the room her new ribs had given her was being filled up. Her lungs expanded and tore through her bronchi, which now began to rebuild itself. She coughed up bloody phlegm, and Piper's torso and arms were now engulfed in fur, and she was transforming further. Her arms lengthened and grew tense, engorged muscles. The same happened with her body. Her abs were growing, forming visibly tough muscle. Now, all that was left was her neck and head, which had become covered in fur. Piper's tears began falling at an even greater rate as the sheer terror she was experiencing racked up from 1 to 10 in seconds. And she was turning in the middle of London.
Why? What have I done to deserve this pain? It's not meant to feel this way.
Piper cried. Her ears suddenly felt like fire as they began to curve and stretch. They moved further up her head. Piper felt her teeth vibrating and they started to feel very cold. She could feel something below them and watched the first of many fall from her mouth. She clutched her silky hair and cried harder. Why was she here? Fangs began throwing her teeth out from her mouth, sharp enough to shred anything to pieces. Her new teeth finished moving into place.
Detective, run!
Piper screamed as her new voice degenerated into an unintelligible scream. Her face pushed forward and formed a muzzle, and it was immobilized by black fur along with her now black wet nose. Piper forced her eyes shut for a moment, covering her face in her hands and backing her huge frame away from Charlie before her body clicked. Piper lowered her hands, and before standing up a full 7 feet tall, her eyes were now bright yellow and all sense of humanity gone. Charlie didn't run. He wanted to observe this beast. He anticipated that, given her bulk, she wouldn't be able to make it up the narrow staircase. He kept his eyes on her as he backed away. His foot hit the stair and he tripped. The werewolf saw this as an opportunity to strike. Charlie kicked off both his shoes and bolted up the stairs, and he heard Piper try to make it up, but she was simply too big. Charlie heard Piper leave the cafe, where a large commotion had formed. He didn't need to see what was happening out there. Hundreds of bystanders had just seen what happened, and who knows how many videos, and now they weren't running. Maybe they saw this as a big project by some film company, and a small applause scattered across the crowd. This applause turned to confusion, and then to horror, as a piercing scream cut into the night. Then more screams and stamping of feet and running. Charlie heard an inhuman growl before another scream, which was shortly cut off. He saw an arm fly across from the cafe, and then another crunch of bones before another quieter growl of happiness filled his ears. Whatever had become of Piper stepped fully into the night. She let out an eerie howl into the sky and bolted towards the screaming, fleeing crowd. Charlie dropped his head into his hands and began to cry. What had he just done? The Beast Within. The Lost. Part 4. Let's get straight into that. Panic, fear, stampede. If you fell, No one would pick you up. If you fell, you were left for dead by the masses. 999 calls, screams, growls. The creature had been unleashed upon the city, and now London would pay dearly. Armed police were on their way, and they listened to Charlie's report, at least. A bit of context. Piper Rosenthal, the girl who had popped up in London after being missing for nearly 3 months, had been given a final night of freedom before her inevitable incarceration at the mental facility the next day. Unfortunately, this gift was part of a larger plan developed by a certain detective, Charlie Lancaster, in which she would be killed after reaching her werewolf form, and Charlie would be able to further experiment on her. Charlie, at that moment, was in a heap at the foot of some stairs at the Pret-a-Manger, crying. A bloody, disembodied arm had been thrown across the floor. Nobody else was in the building. They'd left when Piper had begun to transform. Charlie had stayed there, watching her, instead of running away while he had the chance. She had now been unleashed into London. A 7-foot-tall killing machine. Charlie thought that Piper's first victim of the night would have run, but he was far from correct. Everybody who had witnessed Piper exit the cafe in her werewolf form was running. There must have been a couple of 100 people there, and Charlie knew that a few 999 calls were probably made. And if the officers had listened to his report, then they'd know that this was important. Armed police, probably. And talking of which, right on cue. There were heavy footsteps before a commanding voice yelled, "Armed police!" And Charlie sat up. "It's just me," he weakly spoke. A masked officer appeared at the entrance of the stairs. "Where's everybody else?" he asked. Charlie shook his head. "The fleeing masses." The officer handed Charlie his shoes and turned around to signal to a few more officers. Charlie pulled on his shoes and stood up. The officer escorted him outside. "We have backup on the way. You can give a testimony then if you want." The officer nodded. "I'm a detective, you prat," Charlie angrily retorted before shoving his badge in the officer's face. The officer backed away. "My mistake, sir," he gruffly apologized. "I know what has happened." Charlie, following his own strategy, quickly seized the initiative. "We need to follow the crowd. Inform the backup about your movements. Check the bodies," he ordered. The squad, 7 strong, left behind a police van. 2 stayed behind, while Charlie led the squad commander and assumed sergeant, and the other 4 towards the remnants of Piper's first death toll. There were a few dead bodies, around 4. Surprisingly, only 2 were mauled, while the others seemed to have been crushed in a stampede. The officers spread out before one yelled towards the others, "There's a live one here!" The other officers approached his comrade with safeties off, rifles slung over their shoulders, while Charlie approached cautiously. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, had a large, bloody bite mark on his leg. "What are his injuries like?" Charlie asked. The officer looked at the detective through their mask. "Only a flesh wound, sir. Given your report, I'm amazed he came off so well." There was a pang of excitement in her voice, almost as if it was her first time out in the field. Charlie's jaw dropped. "Shit," he shouted, ran towards the hyperventilating man. He remembered to one of the interviews he'd given Danny. Bite marks. The man looked at the detective, and then at his leg. "Sergeant!" Charlie yelled. The sergeant appeared behind him. "Yes, sir?" he asked. "Shoot him!" Charlie abruptly said. The sergeant looked at him, and he raised his visor. "What?" he gasped. "You heard me! Shoot him!" Charlie responded. The whole squad looked at Charlie, including the man. "Get his trousers off," Charlie asked the officer, on the ground helping the man. She did as she was asked. "If he's just been bitten by a creature with a bite force strong enough to crush his skull, then where the fuck is the wound?" Charlie pointed to the man's leg. The sergeant looked closely. There was no wound. "Maybe blood splashed on him," he replied. "His trouser is torn." "This boy's been bitten by a werewolf. In a few minutes he'll be just as dangerous as Piper," Charlie argued. The sergeant backed away. "I'm not shooting at innocent." "Oh, you'll be happy when he tears your body into 2? Charlie retorted. The sergeant shook his head. "I can't." The man looked at Charlie, tears in his eyes. Unfortunately for him, the moon was right next to the detective's face. The man howled in agony and Charlie exclaimed, "Why do I have to do everything myself?" He quickly yanked out the sergeant's holstered pistol, checked for ammunition, switched off the safety, took aim, and fired twice. The man went limp, 2 small bloody holes in his skull. The squad fell silent. "And no doubt there are more of them," Charlie growled. "Wait for backup, and then we'll pursue her." Backup arrived promptly. The van pulled up next to the first. Charlie talked to the commander of the fresh batch, and he was given command of the new 7 and nodded to them. Oliver Hassan stepped out of the passenger side van, nodding to Charlie, and 3 members of the other squad followed suit, and Charlie and Oliver found themselves in charge of 10 armed police officers. "Get CSI down here. There are a shit ton of bodies to come," Charlie calmly spoke. He followed the screams. Euphoria. That was the one word she was feeling, as her claws fell through flesh like bread and her teeth clamped down through bone. She could claim her revenge, maybe even raise an army of monsters to follow her will. Only one bite, a gentle nick. She saw some runners enter a building, a shop. She saw the attendant lock the door and turn all the lights off. Why were they running from the joy of transformation? She shrugged and prepared herself for a run-up. She backed up slightly before launching her 250-pound bulk at top speed into the locked reinforced glass door. Faster, faster, speed, smash! Glass was going everywhere. She could enter the shop now, and she approached it. She couldn't get in. She was too big. She was growling loudly and tore the doorway out of the building's superstructure. Now there was enough room for her to get in. She heard crying. Her piercing eyes could easily see in the dark. It was not hard to find them, and she could smell their fear. She could smell the rancid sweat coming from them. There was a display cabinet in front of her, and she ripped that out of the way. No one there. Shit. She stalked her way to the till. There was a lot of light. This was a jeweler's. What a prestigious death. No, she wasn't going to kill these people. She was going to add them to the ranks of her army of wolf kind. The joy of transformation. She drawled slightly at the thought of the weaklings shedding their old bodies and being shown the true goodness and benefits of her condition. She was snapped back into reality by the sound of the door being frantically fiddled with. The bastards were trying to escape. She silently strode across the jeweller's, dodging broken glass and items of stock. She bounded over to the till and tried to get into the storeroom. As usual, she was too big. She growled loudly in anger and tore the doorway out of the wall. She knew that the building may collapse, but decided that it was worth the risk and worth taking. She could see them, fiddling with the black door. She walked towards them and reached ahead, tearing the door handles off the wood. The group screamed. Their minds were awash with horror now. She forced a grin from her muzzle. They didn't need to worry. She wasn't going to kill them. She was just going to make them see the joy of transformation. Charlie was angry, filled with righteous fury to correct his wrongs. He was going to make Piper pay for the murdering innocents and indirectly ended potentially hundreds more. His blood boiled. He broke into a run as he saw blood trails and trampled newspapers. It was eerily quiet, but in the distance there was a screaming and police sirens. Charlie looked at the street number. Lambeth. Shit. Piper was heading to the city's centre. He heard crying coming from a jeweller's. Safety's off. Charlie alerted the armed police. They crept towards the building, and Charlie nodded to the doorway. It had been torn from the front of the building itself. Fucking hell, he muttered. The police approached the door and walked through. Their feet crunched on the broken glass. Charlie pushed the other officers and charged through. The crying was coming from the storeroom. He backed up against the shattered doorway. "Sir, get back!" One of the officers grabbed Charlie's shoulder. "We'll deal with it, sir. Don't worry." The officer cocked his rifle and charged in. "Armed police, stay where you are!" he shouted. Charlie followed him in. "Holy shit," he gasped. There were at least 8 people slumped up against the back door. The youngest was probably a 14-year-old girl, while the oldest was around middle-aged. They had scratches and soft bite marks on their flesh. Charlie looked over at the officers, who began appearing in the doorway. "What in God's name happened here?" he yelled at at the victims. A girl, maybe 16 or 17, spoke up first. "She came through. She came through and attacked us, but not to kill us, only to attack us." Her eyes filled with tears. "She had intelligence in her eyes. She knew what she was doing." She began to cry. Charlie looked at her. "What did she look like?" he asked. A man looked at him. She was big and bulky, with long black hair and black fur. She had bright yellow eyes, and, she had massive tits." He awkwardly averted his gaze from Charlie's eyes. "She was a werewolf," the 14-year-old girl said. Charlie looked at the officers. "Kill them all," he snarled. The victims looked in shock. The leading officer shoved Charlie out the way. "They're injured, you prick! I'm not going to listen to you, you eating twat who can't shoot." He raised his visor. Charlie smirked. "Given that I've already killed a man tonight, oh, fuck off! I'm not killing a civilian." The officer shouted. "Enjoy death," Charlie calmly replied. The other officers thought back to his report. "Bite marks and scratches will make them werewolves like her. I'm sure you don't want more of them." Charlie looked coldly into the officer's eyes. The man gulped. "Very well, detective." The same girl looked at him. "How could you? You're meant to protect us." She was cold with fear. Charlie stared into her tear-struck eyes. "I would protect you if I could, but you see, that ship has sailed." Charlie left the room. Gunfire shot through the shop for a few seconds before it stopped. A thin whimper was heard before the roar of military-grade weapons continued for another few seconds. Fear. Fear was spreading across London. People were locking their doors. People were hiding. People were watching their backs. This was perfect for Piper, as it was easy to find victims, not only to add to the ranks of her army, but to give them enough food when the joy of transformation reached their virgin minds. And she was easy enough to track, and any door that was bashed in had the house promptly raided. By the time Charlie's team got to North Lambeth, approaching the river, they had already requested more ammo and fresh backup. Piper needed to reach the centre, enough victims for an army to be unleashed upon humanity. Her vengeance was unquenchable. She would make the humans who were turned against her for murder pay. Some may call her a psychopath, sure, but she was more than that. It was this that scared Charlie the most. Piper knew exactly what she was doing. She knew where she was going. She wasn't in a blind rage. He was running out of time, and she needed to be stopped before she made it towards Westminster. He radioed ahead. "This is Detective Lancaster. I need armed police units on every bridge. Evacuate all bridges along the Thames. Safety's off." He received an affirmative and continued pursuing Piper. Oliver Hassan was seeing a different side to Charlie than earlier. Maybe he was so stressed with containing this outbreak that he was doing this. Oliver had lost count how many times shots had been fired, how many times he'd looked into the eyes of innocents in the wrong place at the wrong time. And before the order was given to shoot, and a howl of gunfire tore their gaze into dead expressions. Oliver needed to put a stop to this. If Piper could be killed in Westminster, then that would save North London. The South was compromised at this point, and armed police were on their way. But what bridge was Piper going to take? She needed to choose a bridge with enough room to bolt across. Armed police would be there, and she needed to have a long enough run-up to cleanly rampage through. Millennium was too rickety, and it wasn't in her plans to end up in the Thames, especially in November. Westminster was a bit more reasonable, wide enough for her to spread her arms, long enough to build up some speed. She just had to count on the police not blocking the bridge. No, they wouldn't. Not with hundreds of civilians milling around. But maybe they would be evacuated, taken off the bridge and sent on their way. Maybe the howl of gunfire would stop her. Maybe she'd break through. Actually, of course she'd break through. She was undoubtedly the strongest thing in London. And she was running towards the bridge now. But what was this she could see? Civilians in the way? Londoners? Police were checking them for marks and scratches. She'd done that? Good for her. She knew what she'd do then. She'd raised her head to the sky and howled. It was loud, very loud. People looked over to her heavy footsteps. and her bulk. People were now screaming, running, and police were falling back. People were dashing across the bridge now, and it was turning into a stampede again, and people were falling over in pure panic and fear. She ran faster, bloody teeth shining in the floodlights. The smell of gore followed her, and blood dripped from her sharp claws. Blood clotted in her thick fur. Her eyes glinted bright yellow, and staring hungrily at the fleeing crowd. She ran faster and faster, carving her claws through the injured that had been left behind. Blood splashes across the road in the thin streams, and people were screaming louder as they looked back. Police were filtering through the people at a far more hurried rate. A few of them stepped forward and crouched. They aimed their rifles. She ran faster and faster, and they began firing. The heavy gunfire that would normally kill a person in seconds, but not her. Her thick skin deflected the bullets as if they crested her fur. It was making her angrier. Her bloodlust went through the roof, her claws outstretched, her jaw unhinged, wide, bearing dozens of fangs. A psychopathic grin spread across her stretched lips, and the officers stopped, firing to reload. And then she was on them. All 250 pounds of her slammed into the ranks, sending a masked officer flying and pinning another. They writhed on the ground as she impaled them with her claws, and she heard a repeated bang and a tickle on her back. She grunted before clamping her jaw down onto the officer's skull, and they stopped moving. She turned around, long black hair twirling with the force of the movement. An officer had taken her mask off and was shooting her again and again with a pistol. And there was a clink, and the gun fell silent. The officer held it up to her face and threw it across the bridge, and she began to cry. Piper spread out her arms and grabbed the officer, ripping her clean in half with a deafening rip, an ear-splitting scream that was cut short. She saw the other officers looking at her, mouths open, and she grinned again. And she bit a gigantic chunk of the dismembered officer's torso before throwing it off the edge of the bridge into the icy Thames. Charlie's team had heard via radio that Piper had reached Westminster, and they were too late. Having just reached the bridge, Charlie cursed. He ordered all the armed police units on duty to head to the bridge, and then he looked at Hassan. "You're a good friend, Ollie," he said. Oliver looked at him. "What?" he asked. Charlie smiled. "This may be the last time we serve together," he replied. Oliver frowned. "Oh," he bit his lip. Charlie nodded and looked across to the river. "We still need to stop her, Ollie," he said. Oliver looked at his watch. It was only 8 p.m. "It's going to be a long night, Charlie," he said. The squad moved cautiously across the blood-splattered bridge. A few abandoned cars lined the road, but since it was the weekend, there were less than usual. Towards the end of the bridge, a few bodies lay slumped in large pools of blood, and one of which had a pistol nearby. "Officer down, Charlie." Oliver looked at the detective. Charlie clenched his fist. He yelled in anger. "Did their bullets do anything?" he shouted. Oliver noticed a darker blood trail. "Yes," he said. The bridge was empty, and Westminster seemed to be as well. The squad moved on. "Oh, this is stupid. Can't we just call a helicopter to find her?" an officer said. Charlie looked at him. "Shit. Go on, call one," he spluttered. Lydia Kelly sat up in her bed in Langham Hotel. She heard helicopters flying past her suite windows and screams. She shrugged. She hadn't been to London much, and so she didn't see this as unordinary. She switched on her TV in the bedroom. The BBC was automatically on, and the anchors today seemed a bit more nervous. Lydia stared intently at the screen. "The Metropolitan Police Service has issued a warning for all civilians situated in Westminster and Mayfair areas to remain indoors due to what witnesses described as a monster roaming the streets. Chief Inspector Miller has announced that this may be connected to the Piper Rosenthal case and has asked for the public to remain calm. On the ground, Bethany Snow reports." Lydia squinted at the TV screen. She unfolded the covers and crawled closer. A blonde woman with her hair tied back appeared on the screen. Armed police ran around frequently as she looked slightly nervous. "Yes, after numerous 999 calls describing a monster were received by the police, they issued a warning to all residents of central London and along the Thames to remain indoors. As seen behind me, armed police have been summoned and are working around the clock to..." She trailed off. Lydia frowned before her eyes widened. Police began shooting past the camera, and Bethany locked herself in shock and dropped her microphone. The camera was knocked over, and a horrifying scream was heard in the background. Bethany's eyes widened and her mouth dropped open before a black shape blocked the screen. Another scream before a ripping of flesh was heard and the camera cut away. "This is not a drill. All residents of Mayfair and Westminster stay indoors." A booming voice came from a black screen. The screen flipped to static. Lydia bit her lip. Shit. She got out of bed and walked over to her window. Regent Street. She pulled on her jeans, a t-shirt and some shoes. Before grabbing her thick jacket, she picked up a keycard before leaving the suite. Meat. Beautiful, delicious meat. Her teeth chomped down on a rib cage as gunfire bounced off her skin. It didn't hurt. It angered her. But she was ravenous. She turned on the group who were firing at her. Her appearance alone, mouth smeared with blood, some of which was dangling off her chin, and gore coating her paws and claws, and holding a decapitated head by the hair, was enough to throw them off of even the toughest officer. She let them go as they ran, and she would grant them mercy. The news reporter had been ripped in half, and that was good to just reach in for the juicy organs quicker. The sweet blood rolling off her tongue, and she grinned. And she wished in some ways that she didn't have the muzzle. Then she could access the red liquid much quicker. She stretched out and threw the head into the air. She hadn't seen any of her army rise yet. Shame. It didn't matter for now, though. For now, she could feast on the meat. Beautiful, delicious meat. Charlie realised that nothing was working. Gunfire bounced off Piper's thick skin. He suddenly thought to himself, silver. He looked at the arms unit that were with him, and then thought back to his superstitious mother. She kept a box that she'd give to Charlie shortly before she died. That had been passed through the generations. She had told him to only open it when he absolutely had to. Charlie gulped. The fate of London was resting on what was in that box. He needed it here, with him, now. In the house in South Kensington, Abigail didn't know why Charlie was taking so long, and she was dressed up to greet him when he got back home from work. Her tight lingerie was uncomfortable, and she was hoping that Charlie would come home quickly so she could get it off. And suddenly, as if it was planned, her phone began to vibrate. It was Charlie. Abigail held the phone up to her ear. "Hello?" she asked. Her fiancé panted on the other end. "Abby, you know my mother's box set? It's in my study." Abigail looked at her hallway to Charlie's study. "Yes," she replied. Charlie chuckled. "Bring it here now, please. Abby, to Charing Cross. Take the tube. It's only a few stops." Charlie panted. Abigail bit her lip. "But it's in Westminster. That's under a curfew," Abigail gasped. "Take the tube. I'll be there to meet you. Don't worry," Charlie responded. "Will you be back soon? I'm dressed up real nice and I don't want to miss any opportunity to..." "Bring the fucking box, Abby," Charlie shouted down the line, and Abigail stopped. "I'm sorry. I'm just stressed. Turn on the news and you'll see why." He hung up. Abigail sighed. She walked up to Charlie's study and found the box. It was heavy and had the Lancaster coat of arms carved into ornate fashion in the woodwork. Abigail huffed. She grabbed her coat and some shoes and left with a row pass and the box in each hand. Charlie wasn't waiting in a deserted station when she arrived, and Abigail's heart rate began to increase as she exited the dark station, even consulting her phone as a flashlight to get up the stairs. Distant gunfire could be heard, and Abigail was getting more nervous and closer she got to the entrance. Behind the ticket booths, a few splotches of blood and footprints headed into the station. Abigail gasped. She was on the brink of losing it. She hopped over the booth and stepped into the night air. Armed police, more blood, and bodies. Abigail screamed. An officer walked over to her. "Get indoors, ma'am. Didn't you hear the broadcast?" they yelled. Slightly distorted through their visor, Abigail was now on the verge of tears. She was not ready for this. She just wanted Charlie. "I've got this for Charlie," she stuttered in fear, and the officer nodded. "Give it here then. I'll be sure to hand it to him." The officer reached for the box. "No, I want to give it to him." Abigail recoiled. The officer went to grab her shoulder and she ran out of the way and dashed across the street, crying for the detective's name. Charlie heard light footsteps and sobs coming from behind him. He turned around and it was Abigail. Oliver looked in the direction too. Abigail ran at full pelt the moment she saw Charlie, and she ran into his arms, wrapping herself tightly around him. "I want to go home. I've seen too much," she cried, and Charlie sighed. "I have to deal with something first," he replied calmly. Abigail looked up at him with her tear-streaked blue eyes. The mascara she was wearing had begun to run, and Charlie kissed her on the lips. "It's not safe if I leave," he said, and Abigail nodded. "Come on." Charlie held her hands tightly. He took the box from her and walked her back to the station. She was silent. She was shaken. She was terrified. Charlie stepped into the darkness of the station, and there was nothing there, only silence. Abigail followed him as they walked across the main hall towards the ticket booths. Charlie was about to help his girlfriend over the gates when Abigail screamed so loudly. She began panting wildly and pointed. Charlie suddenly became very aware of hot breath on his shoulder. He turned around, seeing a leering, monstrous face, black fur, snarling, gory fangs, and glaring yellow eyes. It was Piper. Charlie's eyes widened. The werewolf swung her muscly arm towards his face, and bloody fangs gleaming from the streetlights outside. Abigail pulled his body back, missing Piper's claws by centimetres. They had dodged the first swing, and Piper, not expecting this, clumsily staggered onto her feet as a heavy arm grasped at the air. But it was short-lived. She was quickly back in the room, her long hair swaying with movement. She grinned as she saw Abigail's tear-streaked face. She dived at the terrified girl before a double shot knocked her from her lunge. Abigail screamed. Charlie looked up to see the werewolf picking her huge frame up off the ground and darting for the entrance. Hassan stood in the doorway to the train station, a pistol smoking in his left hand. "Are curfews in place for your girlfriend too?" he asked sarcastically, and Abigail embraced Charlie tightly. Her long hair was wet with sweat. Charlie could feel something warm on his arm. Tears, probably. He looked at his friend. "Thanks will be enough." Oliver rolled his eyes, and Charlie nodded. "Thanks." He looked at Abigail and kissed her on the forehead. Oliver walked forward and squinted. "What's that on her arm?" he asked. Lydia walked down the stairs. The elevator was out of action or had just been stopped manually. The building was completely silent, not a sound. All that could be heard was infrequent distant gunfire. She looked behind her cautiously. If security caught her, she'd be arrested and probably taken back to her room. And she was violating a lockdown after all. Lydia made her way down the carpeted stairwell until she reached the ground floor. The front desk was manned by a well-dressed employee, and she was reading with a small light. As the lobby was pitch black, she looked up as Lydia tiptoed towards the fire exit. "Miss, where do you think you're going?" she asked. Lydia turned around. "I'm going out for a cigarette," she replied. That wasn't entirely a lie. She had just started smoking after all. Only problem was, she was permanently strapped for cash and couldn't afford the luxury, but most of her friends in Dublin had access to the commodity. The clerk frowned. "I'll have to call security. We're under a lockdown." Lydia rolled her eyes and continued walking. She reached the fire exit. "Miss, stop moving and wait," the clerk shouted. Lydia looked at her. "I've seen worse than a guard," she said, before quickly pushing down on a bar and bolting into the autumn night air. "What?" Charlie looked at Abigail. Her arm was bleeding. Several marks lay in her skin. Charlie looked in and pulled out a small red shard. Abigail flinched and looked at him. Charlie looked at it and wiped the blood off. It was a broken piece of tooth. He looked at Abigail. "She got you," he said. Abigail's eyes widened. No, I'm fine." She began to cry. Oliver reloaded his pistol and Charlie looked at him. "Wait, Ollie!" he yelled, and Oliver cocked the gun. "So when it's a stranger you give the order to fire, but when it's you getting married to one in 2 weeks, it's all right?" he asked. Charlie looked at Abigail. "Don't let him, Charlie! Please, don't let him!" she whimpered. She'd only come in to give him a package, hoping that Charlie would come home and give her a good night. But no. She had just been bitten and was about to become the same as Piper. Charlie squeezed his eyes shut. "Charlie, get away!" Oliver yelled. Abigail wrapped her arms around Charlie so tightly he couldn't move. Oliver walked behind his friend. He grabbed Abigail's wrist. "This is Charlie's doctrine," he growled. Abigail let go. Her eyes went so wide he thought they'd pop out of her head. Charlie picked himself up and Abigail collapsed. A look of betrayal escaping across her face, and Oliver raised a pistol and fired twice, filling the room up with 2 quick sparks. Charlie looked at Oliver. "In front of me? Really?" he asked. "It was your fucking report that authorized this shit," Hassan retorted. And Charlie picked up the box and he opened it, and there was a letter inside. To a Lancaster descendant. Of all creatures that have ever existed in this country, the werewolf is by far the most dangerous, unknown to all bar the most noble. These creatures have roamed Scotland for generations. It was only when Royal Highlanders brought the affliction with them to England. We, lads Lancasters, saw this threat early on. We were branded as superstitious, our armories were stocked with silver, our guards were trained regularly. The threat of a potential epidemic is looming, and soon our armories will be empty. This is our secret weapon. This is the wrath of the House of Lancaster. This is the downfall of the cryptid that stalks the Empire. And we have kept the secret of the werewolf secret for far too long. If this is used, then the people know. Godspeed, circa 1894. Charlie folded the letter up. He took a sheet of leather engraved with a house motto off and looked at the contents. A 6-shot revolver with 6 silver bullets. Charlie wasted no time in loading a gun. "I don't care what I said. I'm killing her." He angrily stared at Hassan and he left the station. She was now the Queen of London. The stinging sensation of the bullet lodging in her ear had left her, and she had climbed a building, and now she was looking down on her city. Blood, bones and gore, all had been spilled to give her this title. Her army hadn't risen up yet. Shame. She was waiting for the cacophony of howls to return to her. She let out another one for good measure. Nothing. Silence. A few helicopters crossed the night sky, and she howled again to allow the fear to sink into the city. And this time, however, a call came back. It was young, fresh, inexperienced, and maybe it was found. She jumped off the flat roof building and landed on a car, crushing the roof and setting off the alarm. She ran off to follow the howl. Closer now. Closer. Regent Street. It was on Regent Street. She was getting closer now, and she could smell it. Charlie mimed the howl on Regent Street. The remnants of the armed police unit sitting against the walls. They had lost morale and ammo and were just waiting for death. "It's suicide, Charlie. You're risking the life on everyone here on the bet that she'll stop after you shoot her? Oliver, didn't you get it?" Charlie looked at him. "I have this. Silver," he replied. Oliver joined the officers. "We'll wait," he said, and Charlie stood in the road waiting for her, Piper, to arrive. And she could see the vague outline of a man in the road. Nothing much. She cut him down easily, and she leered her fangs and bounded quicker and quicker. She grinned widely, thinking of the blood running down her tongue, and she drooled. The figure was getting closer and closer. It was familiar, though. It was Charlie. She licked her lips. Revenge was sweet. He had something in his hand. A gun? Stupid. Bullets bounced off her. Indestructible. She was closing in. 100 meters. 75. 50. 20. Charlie raised the weapon. She saw the bullet glint in the barrel. 10 meters. She savoured the taste of his flesh. Bang! And with a soft whimper, Piper's speed was sawn in half. Charlie's shots had gone directly in her left shoulder. She looked more shocked than anything else, and she didn't think bullets could harm her. Charlie fired again, directly into her leg, and with a louder groan she collapsed. The crunch of the bone signalled to Charlie that a shot had broken her leg. She fell face down onto the floor and skidded across the tarmac of the road. Another shot, and through the right side of her body this time. It entered through her shoulder and was embedded in her lung. She gasped sharply, and Charlie emptied his barrel, releasing a hail of bullets into Piper's abdomen. He dropped the gun, standing in front of the dying beast. A click-clack of shoes could be heard from behind the detective, and he turned around. Lydia Kelly. She ran as fast as she could, and though Charlie couldn't see, Piper began to revert into her human form, and she shallowly panted as her lung began to fill with fluid. Lydia barged past Charlie, grabbing her friend and crouching down onto the ground. Her naked body glistened with blood and gore, but 6 deep wounds could be seen in her flesh. Piper held a bloody hand on her abdomen, and Lydia sat down and holstered the girl onto her lap. "Fucking help!" she yelled at the officers. They didn't move, too shocked to stand. Piper wiped her hand on Lydia's neck. You were always my best friend," she weakly spoke. She breathed heavily, and her breath rattled with each movement. Lydia clutched Piper's cold hand. Same here, she smiled, and Piper began to cry. I'm sorry for... She struggled, and Lydia hushed her. I know. She too began to cry. Piper looked into the sky. Her cold skin seemed paler than usual, her violet eyes standing out like lanterns. I don't want to go, she whimpered. It was Danny's fault. Get him convicted, please, she gasped. It seemed that near death, the lost would return to their normal state. Lydia looked into her eyes, and Piper inhaled sharply. Goodbye, Lydia, she whispered, and she went limp and keeled over into her friend's arms. Charlie looked at Piper's dead body. He didn't bother to tell Lydia Kelly to step away. The first cracks of dawn broke the horizon. He reached into his coat and produced his radio. It's Detective Lancaster. Lift the curfew. Piper's dead. And he spoke into the speaker. There was a static before a voice came back. Understood, sir. That afternoon, Charlie stood on the roof of Scotland Yard, overlooking the city. It was windy, and his coat blew in the light breeze. He hadn't slept. He'd just given a file over to Oliver and had gone to Danny's trial. Sergeant James Clark appeared behind him. Miller's putting you on tribunal, he said, and Charlie nodded. I know, I don't mind, as long as I get what I'm after, he said. James stood next to him. How many werewolves do you think are still out there? He asked. Charlie looked at him. A few hundred, probably. They'll be found eventually, he replied. His eyes looked out over the buildings, and he handed James the box. This is the gun that killed her. If you want it, it's yours. James took it. He was about to leave. Listen, at your tribunal, just remember, you got the job done. You can use her as a defense. James left, leaving Charlie alone to look over the city. Wow. Absolutely stupendous, wonderful, heart-racing story there. Thank you so much, WolfInSpace. Absolutely amazing writer. I'm so proud and blessed to have you on the show as one of our writers. Thank you so much for your dedication, your input, and your support, of course. Guys and girls, you know the drill. As ever, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag TeamFEAR. That will be it for this series for a little bit, but hopefully WolfInSpace will be touching back on this one with a little twist in the near future. As ever, guys, I hope you've all had a wonderful working week and are looking forward to a relaxing weekend. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.